Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Adderall, the little orange pill that somehow became more valuable than cocaine on college campuses. A medication designed to help hyperactive 8-year-olds sit still in class now funds spring break trips and changes hands in library bathrooms for $20 a pop. The same drug that concerned mothers give their children every morning is crushed and snorted by pre-med students pulling all-nighters. America manufactures enough amphetamines annually to give every citizen a month-long supply, and somehow we pretend this is about treating a medical condition, rather than running a massive legal speed distribution network. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how a controlled substance became campus currency, you first need to understand that amphetamines weren't invented in a pharmaceutical lab, but in an academic chemistry department, by a man who had no idea what he'd created. In 1887, Romanian chemist Lazar Edeleanu worked in a Berlin laboratory, synthesizing new compounds from coal tar derivatives. He created phenylisopropylamine through a relatively simple chemical process. The molecule sat in academic journals for decades, completely ignored. Edeleanu published his findings, earned his doctorate, and moved on to other projects. Nobody recognized that this unremarkable compound would eventually reshape human productivity, warfare, and consciousness itself. The first amphetamine molecule existed for 40 years, before anyone discovered what it actually did to the human brain. Researchers occasionally synthesized it for academic purposes, testing its properties in isolated experiments. The compound showed some interesting characteristics, but nothing immediately useful. Then the 1920s arrived with new pharmacological testing methods. American chemist Gordon Alice began experimenting with amphetamine variants in 1929, searching for a synthetic replacement for ephedrine in asthma treatments. Ephedrine came from the mahuang plant and supply couldn't meet demand. Alice needed something that could be mass-produced in factories rather than harvested from fields. Alice tested amphetamine on himself first, as scientists did before ethics committees existed. He injected 50 milligrams and spent the next several hours in a state of euphoric alertness he'd never experienced. His mind raced through thoughts with unusual clarity. Physical fatigue vanished. The world seemed sharper, more manageable, more interesting. He felt capable of anything. The sensation lasted for hours before gradually fading into exhaustion. Alice realized he'd discovered something far more powerful than an asthma medication. He'd found a drug that fundamentally altered human consciousness and capability. Smith, Kline and French pharmaceutical company bought the rights to amphetamine in 1932. They marketed it as Benzedrine, packaging it in inhalers for nasal congestion and asthma. The Benzedrine inhaler became one of the most brilliantly deceptive products in pharmaceutical history. Each inhaler contained 250 milligrams of amphetamine-soaked paper strips. The official instructions said to crack open the plastic tube and inhale the vapors. Users quickly discovered they could open the inhaler, remove the paper strip, and either chew it or soak it in coffee. One inhaler provided enough amphetamine for a serious high. College students discovered this trick almost immediately. By 1937, Smith, Kline and French released Benzedrine in tablet form, marketing it for a spectacular range of conditions. The pills supposedly treated depression, narcolepsy, alcoholism, schizophrenia, allergies, and low blood pressure. Doctors prescribed amphetamines for weight loss, fatigue, and general malaise. The medical establishment embraced speed with remarkable enthusiasm. Housewives received prescriptions to manage their weight and energy levels. Truck drivers used it to stay awake on long hauls. Students employed it for exam preparation. Athletes experimented with it for performance enhancement. Nobody discussed addiction or long-term consequences because the concept of stimulant dependence barely existed in medical literature. The pharmaceutical industry manufactured competing amphetamine products throughout the late 1930s. Different companies created their own variants and brand names. By 1943, the American Medical Association estimated that medical amphetamine use had exploded to treat at least 39 different conditions. Doctors prescribed it casually, refilled prescriptions indefinitely, and rarely questioned whether patients actually needed the drug. Amphetamines became the answer to dozens of medical questions that probably required different solutions. The drugs worked immediately and obviously, unlike most medications that required weeks or months to show effects. Patients loved them because they felt amazing. Doctors loved them because patients kept coming back. Then World War II transformed amphetamines from a popular medication into a military necessity. The German military issued Pervitin, a methamphetamine variant, to soldiers starting in 1938. Pilots received it to stay alert during long missions. Tank crews used it to maintain focus during extended operations. Infantry consumed it before major offensives. The Blitzkrieg strategy required soldiers who could fight for days without sleep, and Pervitin made that possible. German forces consumed an estimated 35 million tablets of Pervitin between April and July 1940 during the invasion of France. Wehrmacht pharmacologists developed special formulations for different military branches, optimizing doses for maximum performance with minimal side effects. American and British forces watched German soldiers operating with superhuman endurance and decided they needed their own supply. The US military distributed Benzedrine tablets to troops starting in 1942. Airmen received them before bombing runs over Europe. Ground forces used them during prolonged combat operations. The Pacific Theater saw especially heavy use as soldiers fought in brutal jungle conditions requiring constant alertness. American forces consumed approximately 180 million Benzedrine tablets during the war. British troops received their own amphetamine rations. Japanese forces used their own stimulant variants. By 1945, essentially every major military force had chemical enhancement programs for their soldiers. The war ended, but amphetamine use exploded rather than declining. Millions of veterans returned home with acquired habits and knowledge about these pills that made fatigue disappear. Pharmaceutical companies ramped up civilian production to meet surging demand. Post-war America embraced amphetamines with startling enthusiasm. Doctors wrote prescriptions freely for anyone complaining of tiredness, sadness, or excess weight. The 1950s housewife culture ran on amphetamines masked as diet pills. Products like Dexedrine and Despetal promised effortless weight loss and boundless energy. Women consumed them daily, often for years, while raising children and managing households. The drugs delivered exactly what they promised: suppressed appetite, increased energy, elevated mood, and complete inability to sleep without sedatives. By the 1960s, American pharmaceutical companies manufactured enough amphetamines to supply every citizen with approximately 50 doses annually. The number was staggering even by the standards of pill-happy Cold War America. Underground distribution networks emerged as people realized amphetamines had substantial recreational value beyond their prescribed uses. Truck drivers bought them illegally to drive longer routes. College students used them for studying. The beatnik counterculture embraced them alongside other consciousness-altering substances. Criminal organizations began manufacturing their own amphetamine variants in illegal laboratories. Speed became a street drug with its own culture, slang, and distribution systems operating parallel to legitimate medical channels. The medical establishment began noticing disturbing patterns among long-term amphetamine users. Patients developed tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effects. Many showed signs of psychological dependence, becoming anxious or depressed without their pills. Cardiovascular problems emerged in heavy users. Psychotic episodes occurred at high doses or with prolonged use. The drugs that seemed like miracle cures in the 1940s revealed darker characteristics when used continuously for years. Research papers documented amphetamine addiction, though pharmaceutical companies disputed the terminology and claimed proper medical use prevented dependency problems. Congress finally acted in 1970, passing the Controlled Substances Act that reclassified amphetamines as Schedule II drugs. The designation meant high potential for abuse but accepted medical uses under strict regulation. Doctors faced new restrictions on prescribing amphetamines. Pharmacies required special records and security measures. Legal production quotas limited how many pills manufacturers could make annually. The FDA forced pharmaceutical companies to remove amphetamines from diet pills and narrow their approved uses to narcolepsy and specific attention disorders. The golden age of casual amphetamine prescribing crashed to a halt. Amphetamine prescriptions plummeted through the 1970s as doctors became cautious about legal liability and medical boards investigated overprescribing. The drugs that once treated everything suddenly treated almost nothing. Pharmaceutical companies reformulated diet pills without amphetamines, producing far less effective versions. Millions of Americans who'd consumed amphetamines daily for years suddenly faced withdrawal and the return of whatever conditions the drugs had masked. The medical establishment collectively pretended the previous 40 years of reckless prescribing hadn't happened. Research papers quietly documented the scope of iatrogenic addiction created by doctors following accepted medical practice. But amphetamines didn't disappear from medicine entirely. One specific use survived the regulatory crackdown and would eventually resurrect the entire industry, treating hyperactive children who couldn't focus in school. The condition had various names throughout the decades, but by the 1980s it would be standardized as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The idea of giving stimulants to children seemed paradoxical, even cruel, yet the treatment worked in ways researchers still didn't fully understand. Hyperactive kids calmed down, inattentive students focused better, impulsive children gained self-control. The mechanism remained mysterious, but the results were undeniable. This narrow medical foothold would become the foundation for amphetamine's complete resurrection. Within 20 years, these controlled substances would return to their former ubiquity under a new name and a new diagnosis. The pharmaceutical industry learned valuable lessons from the 1970s crackdown. Next time, they wouldn't market amphetamines for everything. They'd focus on one specific condition, build an unassailable medical consensus around it, and create a prescription pipeline that regulators couldn't easily shut down. The stage was set for Adderall's emergence, though nobody in 1970 could have predicted how thoroughly amphetamines would reconquer American medicine and culture. The first chapter had ended, the second was about to begin. The medical condition that would resurrect amphetamines began not as a diagnosis, but as an observation about children who couldn't behave properly. British paediatrician George Still delivered a series of lectures in 1902, describing children with serious deficits in moral control and sustained attention. These weren't children with obvious brain damage or intellectual disabilities. They appeared normal but couldn't maintain focus, follow rules, or control impulses the way other children did naturally. Still theorized some biological defect in their volitional inhibition, though he had no evidence beyond behavioral observation. His lectures introduced the idea that extreme misbehavior might reflect medical pathology rather than poor parenting or moral failure. The concept languished in medical literature for decades, while doctors focused on more pressing pediatric concerns like infectious diseases and malnutrition. Occasionally, researchers published papers about children with unusual attention problems, but no coherent framework emerged. Then the 1937 discovery that benzodrine calmed hyperactive children created a puzzle that demanded explanation. Charles Bradley, a Rhode Island physician, administered amphetamines to children with behavioral problems and documented miraculous improvements in their schoolwork and conduct. The findings seemed completely backwards. Stimulants should increase hyperactivity, not reduce it. Bradley published his results to widespread skepticism from colleagues who couldn't reconcile the paradox. World War II interrupted pediatric research as medical resources shifted to military needs. The connection between amphetamines and childhood behavior problems remained a curiosity rather than a research priority. Post-war psychiatry focused on psychoanalytic explanations for behavioral issues, blaming parenting styles and unconscious conflicts rather than neurological differences. Hyperactive children were sent to therapists who explored their relationships with their mothers. The treatments produced minimal results, but satisfied the prevailing theoretical frameworks. Amphetamines remained available for extreme cases, prescribed cautiously by doctors who didn't understand why they worked. The 1950s brought new interest in childhood behavioral disorders as schools reported increasing numbers of disruptive students. Teachers complained about children who couldn't sit still, wouldn't follow instructions, and disrupted entire classrooms despite normal intelligence. Researchers began systematic studies of these children, documenting consistent patterns across different cases. They exhibited excessive motor activity, short attention spans, impulsivity, and difficulty following rules. The syndrome seemed distinct from other childhood conditions. Doctors called it minimal brain dysfunction, assuming some subtle neurological damage caused the symptoms, even though no brain damage appeared in tests. Methylphenidate entered the picture in 1954 when Swiss company Ciba synthesized the new stimulant. They marketed it as Ritalin starting in 1955, initially targeting depression and chronic fatigue in adults. The drug works similarly to amphetamines but with supposedly fewer side effects and less abuse potential. Pediatricians began experimenting with Ritalin for hyperactive children after seeing amphetamine successes. The results matched benzodrine's effectiveness. Children transformed from classroom terrors into manageable students within hours of taking their first dose. Parents reported dramatic improvements at home. Teachers sent grateful letters to doctors who'd prescribed the medication. The 1960s saw researchers attempting to understand the paradoxical stimulant effect through new theories about brain chemistry. They hypothesized that hyperactive children had underactive brain systems governing attention and impulse control. Stimulants boosted activity in these regulatory regions, allowing normal self-control to emerge. The theory explained why drugs that made normal people speedy and jittery helped hyperactive children calm down and focus. Evidence remained circumstantial, but the logic convinced many physicians. Prescriptions increased steadily throughout the decade as doctors gained confidence in the treatment approach. The diagnosis underwent multiple name changes as researchers refined their understanding. Minimal brain dysfunction became hyperkinetic reaction of childhood in the 1968 edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The new name removed the implication of brain damage while maintaining the concept of biological dysfunction. Diagnostic criteria remained vague and subjective, relying entirely on behavioral observation by parents and teachers. No blood tests or brain scans could confirm the condition. Doctors diagnosed ADHD based on checklists of symptoms like fidgeting, interrupting others, difficulty waiting turns, and failure to finish tasks. Critics argued this medicalized normal childhood behavior, turning energetic kids into patients. The 1970s backlash against amphetamines threatened to destroy stimulant treatment for children, along with adult prescriptions. Parent groups organized against medicating children for behavioral problems. The Church of Scientology launched aggressive campaigns claiming psychiatrists were drugging children into submission. Lawsuits emerged from families alleging unnecessary medication and side effects. Media coverage portrayed Ritalin as chemical straitjackets for difficult children. Prescriptions declined as nervous doctors avoided potential controversy and liability. The pharmaceutical industry faced the possibility that their last legitimate use for stimulants might disappear entirely. Researchers responded by conducting rigorous studies demonstrating methylphenidate's effectiveness and relative safety. Multiple controlled trials showed significant improvements in attention, behavior, and academic performance compared to placebo. Follow-up studies documented minimal long-term side effects in most children. The scientific evidence accumulated in favor of stimulant treatment, even as cultural controversy intensified. Professional organizations issued guidelines defending appropriate use while acknowledging past overprescribing. The medical establishment drew a line between legitimate treatment and casual drugging, though critics questioned whether the distinction meant anything in practice. The diagnosis evolved again in 1980, when the DSM-3 introduced attention deficit disorder with two subtypes, with or without hyperactivity. This change recognized that some children had severe attention problems without the excessive motor activity. The new framework expanded the potential patient population beyond obviously hyperactive kids to include daydreamers and quietly inattentive students. Diagnostic criteria became more specific, requiring symptoms in multiple settings and ruling out other explanations. Yet the subjective nature remained. Diagnosis still depended entirely on behavioral observations rather than objective measurements. Ritalin prescriptions climbed through the 1980s as diagnostic awareness increased and controversy faded. Teachers learned to recognize ADHD symptoms and recommend evaluations. Parent support groups formed to share information and reduce stigma around medication. Pharmaceutical companies carefully marketed to physicians while avoiding direct consumer advertising that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. By 1990, approximately 900,000 American children took stimulant medications for attention problems. The number seemed large but represented only about 2% of school-age children, suggesting careful diagnostic practices. The diagnosis underwent its final name change in 1987 when DSM-3R introduced attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as the unified term. The revision created three subtypes: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and combined type. This framework remains the current diagnostic approach. The changes reflected growing understanding that attention problems and hyperactivity represented related but distinct symptoms. Some children struggled primarily with focus and organization. Others exhibited mainly impulsivity and excessive activity. Many showed both symptom clusters. The new system allowed more nuanced diagnosis while maintaining a single overarching condition. Research in the 1990s revealed intriguing differences in brain structure and function between ADHD and normal children. Neuroimaging studies showed smaller volumes in specific brain regions involved in attention and executive control. Genetic studies identified heritable components to the condition. Neurotransmitter research documented differences in dopamine system functioning. The biological evidence strengthened claims that ADHD represented genuine neurological variation rather than social construction or medical imperialism. Critics still questioned whether these differences justified widespread medication, but the condition's biological basis became increasingly difficult to dispute. The diagnosis rate exploded through the 1990s as awareness campaigns reached parents and teachers. Between 1990 and 2000, the number of American children on ADHD medication jumped from 900,000 to 3.4 million. The nearly fourfold increase sparked renewed controversy about overdiagnosis and medicalization of childhood. Some argued that modern culture created attention problems through overstimulation and reduced tolerance for normal childhood energy. Others insisted that ADHD had always existed, but previous generations went undiagnosed and struggled unnecessarily. The debate generated more heat than light, as both sides marshaled statistics supporting their positions. Pharmaceutical companies watched these developments with intense interest because patent protection on Ritalin and original amphetamines was expiring. Generic competition would destroy profit margins on existing medications. They needed new formulations they could patent and market as superior to older drugs. The expanding ADHD diagnosis created a growing market, but only new medications would generate the revenue growth investors demanded. Multiple companies began developing next-generation stimulants with improved delivery mechanisms, longer duration, and reduced abuse potential. The race was on to create the blockbuster ADHD medication that would dominate the market for decades. Professional disagreement about ADHD remained intense despite accumulating research. Some psychiatrists viewed it as a legitimate neurological condition, affecting perhaps 5% of children. Others believed rates above 1–2% indicated massive overdiagnosis, driven by pharmaceutical marketing and cultural intolerance for behavioral variation. International comparisons showed wildly different diagnosis rates, suggesting cultural factors shaped medical practice. France diagnosed ADHD at 1/10 the American rate. Britain fell somewhere between. The variation implied that either Americans were uniquely affected or American doctors were uniquely willing to label and medicate normal behavioral differences. Parents found themselves caught between expert disagreement and their children's struggles. Some saw medication as salvation after years of school problems and family conflict. Their children transformed from failing students with no friends into capable, happy kids. Others tried medication and watched their children become zombie-like, losing creativity and personality. Still others refused medication entirely, pursuing behavioral therapy, dietary changes, or acceptance of their child's differences. No consensus emerged about best practices, leaving each family to navigate conflicting advice from doctors, teachers, therapists, and other parents. The stage was set for a new drug to dominate this controversial but lucrative market. ADHD had evolved from obscure medical curiosity to widely diagnosed condition affecting millions of children. Stimulant treatment had survived the 1970s backlash and gained scientific legitimacy. The pharmaceutical industry needed a new product to replace aging medications losing patent protection. Parents, teachers, and doctors had accepted the ADHD framework even amid ongoing debate about overdiagnosis. An entire infrastructure existed for identifying, diagnosing, and treating attention problems in children. All that was missing was the drug that would transform ADHD medication from a treatment into a cultural phenomenon. That drug was waiting in the wings, about to revolutionize not just ADHD treatment, but American achievement culture itself. The drug that would define a generation started as an obesity medication that nobody wanted. Rexa Pharmaceuticals created Obitrol in the 1950s, combining 4 different amphetamine salts into a single weight loss pill. The formula mixed dextroamphetamine saccharate, amphetamine aspartate, dextroamphetamine sulfate, and amphetamine sulfate in specific ratios designed to provide smooth, sustained stimulation. Obitrol sold moderately well through the 1960s, alongside dozens of competing diet pills. Then the 1970 Controlled Substances Act destroyed the diet pill market by reclassifying amphetamines and forcing manufacturers to prove medical necessity for their products. Obertrol survived as a specialty medication, but sales collapsed as doctors stopped prescribing amphetamines for weight loss. Richwood Pharmaceuticals, a small company in Kentucky, acquired the rights to Obertrol in the early 1990s for almost nothing. The medication had negligible sales and no obvious future, but Richwood's executives recognized an opportunity that transformed pharmaceutical garbage into gold. The same 4-amphetamine salt formula that failed for weight loss might succeed for ADHD treatment. Ritalin dominated the market but only lasted 4 hours, requiring multiple daily doses that children forgot to take at school. Parents complained about the hassle of midday dosing, and schools resisted storing and administering controlled substances. An amphetamine formula that lasted 6 to 8 hours could solve these problems while offering something genuinely different from methylphenidate. Richwood rebranded Obertrol as Adderall in 1996, marketing it specifically for ADHD treatment. The name suggested addition or improvement, implying the drug-added capability rather than merely treating deficiency. Initial sales were modest as doctors remained loyal to familiar Ritalin. Then Richwood began an aggressive marketing campaign highlighting Adderall's advantages. Longer duration meant single morning dosing. The 4-salt combination supposedly produced smoother effects than Ritalin, and it offered an alternative for children who didn't respond well to methylphenidate. Sales representatives visited pediatricians and child psychiatrists with free samples, scientific studies, and persuasive presentations about superior outcomes. The marketing strategy worked beyond anyone's projections. First-year sales reached $10 million, impressive for a rebranded obesity drug competing against an entrenched market leader. Doctors appreciated having alternatives for difficult cases. Parents liked avoiding midday school doses. Children reported that Adderall felt different from Ritalin, though placebo effects made such comparisons questionable. Word spread through parent support groups and online forums that were just emerging in the mid-1990s. Adderall developed a reputation as the medication to try when Ritalin didn't work perfectly. Shire Pharmaceuticals spotted Adderall's potential and acquired Richwood in 1997 for $186 million. The price seemed astronomical for a company with one moderately successful product, but Shire's executives understood they'd bought access to the exploding ADHD market with a drug they could aggressively market and gradually improve. Shire possessed resources that Richwood lacked: massive marketing budgets, relationships with major medical organizations, and expertise in maximizing pharmaceutical profits. They immediately ramped up Adderall promotion while planning next-generation formulations that would extend patent protection for decades. Shire's marketing blitz transformed Adderall from a Ritalin alternative into a household name. The company sponsored medical conferences on ADHD diagnosis and treatment. They funded research comparing Adderall favorably to other medications. Patient education materials flooded pediatricians' offices with Shire's branding prominently displayed. Television commercials during family programming showed children struggling in school, then succeeding after starting ADHD treatment. The ads never mentioned Adderall by name due to regulations on controlled substance advertising, but viewers knew which company produced them. Parent magazines ran articles about ADHD that quoted Shire-funded experts and mentioned Adderall as a leading treatment option. Sales exploded through the late 1990s as Adderall captured market share from Ritalin and expanded the overall ADHD medication market. Revenue jumped from $10 million in 1996 to $110 million in 1998, then $759 million by 2004. The growth reflected both stealing customers from competitors and creating new patients who might never have tried medication. Shire's marketing convinced parents that ADHD treatment was safe, effective, and increasingly necessary for academic success in competitive school environments. The diagnosis rate climbed in tandem with Adderall sales, suggesting Shire wasn't just capturing existing patients, but expanding the definition of who needed treatment. Shire introduced Adderall XR in 2001, an extended-release formulation that lasted 12 hours instead of 6. The new version used a clever capsule design containing 2 types of beads, half released immediately while the other half released 4 hours later, producing effectively 2 doses from a single pill. Parents embraced XR enthusiastically because it eliminated all midday dosing concerns and provided coverage through evening homework. Doctors appreciated the improved compliance since children couldn't skip afternoon doses. Shire pushed XR aggressively while quietly phasing out instant-release Adderall, moving patients to the more expensive formulation that enjoyed fresh patent protection. The company developed relationships with advocacy organizations that blurred the line between patient support and pharmaceutical marketing. Shire funded children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the largest ADHD advocacy group in America. They sponsored educational programs in schools that helped teachers identify potential ADHD cases. Informational websites about ADHD featured Shire funding and prominently mentioned Adderall. The strategy created seemingly independent sources all delivering the same message. ADHD was underdiagnosed, medication was essential for success, and Adderall represented the best treatment option. Critics called it disease-mongering and stealth marketing. Shire called it patient education. A crisis emerged in 2005 when Health Canada suspended Adderall XR sales over concerns about cardiovascular risks. Reports suggested the medication might cause sudden death in children with underlying heart conditions. The Canadian decision triggered panic among American parents who'd been assured repeatedly that Adderall was safe. Shire's stock plummeted. Competitors seized the opportunity to promote their own ADHD medications as safer alternatives. Media coverage featured parents whose children had experienced heart problems while taking Adderall. The company faced potential catastrophe as years of marketing investment crumbled within weeks. Shire responded with a comprehensive data offensive demonstrating that Adderall's cardiovascular risk wasn't higher than other ADHD stimulants. They commissioned independent analyses of adverse event reports showing no elevated death rates among Adderall users compared to the general pediatric population. Company-funded researchers published papers defending the medication's safety profile. The FDA conducted its own review and concluded in 2006 that Adderall didn't require removal from the market, though they mandated warnings about cardiovascular risks for all stimulant medications. Canada reversed its suspension. The crisis ended with Adderall's reputation largely intact and sales quickly recovering. The scare actually benefited Shire in unexpected ways. Media coverage made millions of Americans aware of Adderall who'd never heard of it before. The controversy sparked conversations about ADHD treatment in families that hadn't considered medication. Shire emerged looking responsible and transparent rather than defensive. By 2006, Adderall revenue reached $1.7 billion annually, making it one of the most profitable medications in psychiatry. The drug had evolved from a rebranded diet pill into a pharmaceutical juggernaut dominating the ADHD market, despite Ritalin's decades-long head start. Shire's success attracted competitors developing their own next-generation ADHD medications. Companies released long-acting formulations of methylphenidate trying to match Adderall XR's convenience. New molecules entered the market promising fewer side effects or different mechanisms of action. None seriously threatened Adderall's dominance. The 4-amphetamine salt formula became the default ADHD treatment many doctors tried first. generic manufacturers prepared to release cheaper versions once patents expired. The ADHD medication market had grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and Adderall sat at its center. By 2010, over 18 million Americans had received Adderall prescriptions. The number included children, adolescents, and a rapidly growing population of adults newly diagnosed with ADHD. Shire had successfully promoted the idea that attention deficits didn't disappear at age 18, but persisted through adulthood, requiring continued treatment. College students and young professionals represented a vast untapped market. The company funded research on adult ADHD, sponsored continuing education for physicians on recognizing symptoms in adults, and pushed for insurance coverage of lifelong stimulant therapy. The strategy worked brilliantly, as prescriptions to adults aged 2039 tripled between 2006 and 2011. Adderall had become more than a medication. The name entered popular culture as shorthand for pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement. Magazine articles referenced it when discussing academic pressure and performance culture. Television shows featured storylines about students using it to study. Online forums debated its effectiveness and ethics. The drug that started as a rebranded obesity medication had transformed into a cultural phenomenon, medical necessity, and billion-dollar profit engine simultaneously. Shire's executives had achieved something remarkable in pharmaceutical marketing, making a controlled substance seem both essential for health and synonymous with achievement. But Adderall's dominance created unintended consequences that Shire hadn't anticipated or couldn't control. Prescriptions to children and adolescents meant pills were entering households across America. Teenagers with legitimate prescriptions possessed 30 pills monthly, and not all 30 stayed in the prescription bottle. High schools developed underground markets for ADHD medication. Students learned that friends would pay for pills that helped them study longer and focus better on homework. These early transactions seemed harmless enough, just sharing helpful medication like lending a friend Tylenol. Nobody recognized they were establishing distribution networks that would expand dramatically once these students reached college campuses. The pharmaceutical success story was generating its own shadow economy that operated according to different rules than Shire's carefully managed marketing. The company sold pills to patients through legitimate medical channels with proper prescriptions and insurance billing. Then those pills entered informal markets where supply and demand determined prices rather than insurance formularies. Shire received revenue from the initial prescription regardless of where the pills ultimately ended up. This created perverse incentives where overprescribing and diversion increased company profits, even if they violated medical ethics and federal law. The system worked perfectly for Shire as long as nobody examined it too carefully. Federal regulators noticed suspicious prescribing patterns, but struggled to address them effectively. The Drug Enforcement Administration set annual manufacturing quotas for amphetamines based on projected medical need. Pharmaceutical companies consistently argued that quotas were too low to meet legitimate demand. Patient advocacy groups supported raising limits to ensure medication access. The DA increased quotas annually through the 2000s, even as prescription rates climbed faster than ADHD diagnosis rates alone could explain. Someone was consuming all those pills, but determining whether use was legitimate or diverted proved nearly impossible when millions of people had legal prescriptions. Shire had resurrected amphetamines more successfully than anyone imagined possible 30 years after the Controlled Substances Act nearly destroyed them. The company discovered that concentrating on a single diagnosis and marketing relentlessly to the relevant patient population could overcome regulatory restrictions and cultural skepticism. Adderall sales exceeded the combined revenue of all amphetamines in the diet pill era, while maintaining the veneer of responsible medicine rather than widespread drugging. The strategy provided a blueprint for pharmaceutical success that other companies studied and copied. The only question was how long the growth could continue before something broke. That question would be answered on college campuses where Adderall was about to become something no pharmaceutical executive could advertise, but everyone would recognize: the unofficial drug of American ambition. The transformation from children's medication to campus currency began with a simple realization among college students who'd taken Adderall throughout high school. They arrived at university with prescriptions expecting to continue their normal routine, then noticed classmates staring with interest when they pulled out orange pills in the library. Study groups asked what they were taking. Dorm mates inquired whether the medication really helped with focus. These students possessed something valuable without realizing it yet. The first transactions occurred almost accidentally, someone mentioning they had finals coming up and couldn't concentrate, the prescribed student offering to share one pill to help out a friend. Money changed hands casually, $5 or $10, less than the cost of textbooks, but enough to establish that these pills had market value. Word spread through residential colleges with remarkable speed during the early 2000s. Freshmen struggling with their first round of midterms heard rumors about medication that made studying effortless. Upperclassmen confirmed the rumors and provided contact information for students with prescriptions willing to sell. Campus dealers emerged organically, students with legitimate diagnoses who realized their monthly prescription could generate significant income. A 30-pill prescription worth $50 at the pharmacy could sell for $200 or more depending on timing and location. Students who'd never considered drug dealing found themselves running profitable businesses from their dorm rooms, conducting transactions in libraries, dining halls, and academic buildings. The typical origin story followed a predictable pattern that repeated at universities nationwide. Stressed freshmen received average grades first semester, despite working harder than ever in high school. Second semester brought increased pressure and fear of academic probation or losing scholarships. A roommate or friend mentioned trying Adderall before finals and experiencing breakthrough study sessions. The struggling student borrowed or bought a pill, took it before a major exam, and experienced 4 to 6 hours of unprecedented focus and energy. Everything suddenly made sense. Lectures that seemed incomprehensible became clear. Dense textbooks transformed into manageable texts. The student attributed their improved performance to the medication, rather than extra study time or reduced anxiety. They sought their own supply for future exams. University health centers became unwitting distribution points for campus drug markets. Students learned which symptoms to report during appointments, childhood attention problems that were never diagnosed, current academic struggles despite effort, difficulty focusing during lectures, tendency to procrastinate on assignments. The standard ADHD screening questionnaires were designed for identifying genuine cases, but worked equally well for coaching people toward positive diagnoses. Campus doctors saw dozens of students weekly during high-demand periods, conducted 15-minute appointments, and relied heavily on self-reported symptoms they couldn't verify. Declining to prescribe meant potentially harming a student who genuinely needed treatment. Prescribing to everyone who reported appropriate symptoms was safer from a liability perspective. Survey data documented the explosion with disturbing clarity. A 2002 study found approximately 5% of college students reported using prescription stimulants non-medically at least once. By 2005, that number reached 10% at many universities. Competitive schools showed higher rates than less selective institutions. Pre-med and engineering students reported more frequent use than humanities majors. By 2010, surveys at elite universities found 25 to 30% of students admitting non-medical stimulant use. The real numbers were likely higher since surveys relied on students honestly reporting illegal drug use to researchers, An entire generation of college students now viewed Adderall as a standard academic tool rather than a controlled substance. The economics created self-reinforcing market dynamics that guaranteed continued expansion. Students with prescriptions could sell pills for $5 to $20, depending on dosage, timing, and local supply. Regular users needed multiple pills weekly during heavy academic periods. A student spending $50 monthly on Adderall for regular use was conservative. Heavy users during finals could spend several $100s. Campus dealers with legitimate prescriptions generated income that paid for textbooks, rent, entertainment, and other drugs. The profit margins were too attractive to resist. Students who initially sold pills only to close friends expanded their customer base and began purchasing from multiple prescribed students to meet demand. Prescription rates among college students tripled between 2006 and 2011, increasing far faster than ADHD diagnosis rates in the general population. The pattern suggested that students sought prescriptions specifically for college performance, rather than treatment of lifelong conditions. Campus health centers prescribed stimulants to 10 to 15% of students at some universities, rates far exceeding childhood ADHD prevalence estimates. Pharmaceutical companies publicly expressed concern about diversion while privately celebrating prescription growth in the college demographic. Every prescription written created potential for both legitimate use and illegal sale, but only the initial prescription generated revenue regardless of where pills ended up. The cultural normalization happened faster than anyone anticipated. Within a decade, Adderall shifted from children's medication that some college students diverted into an accepted part of campus culture, alongside coffee, energy drinks, and all-nighters. Students discussed using it openly in dining halls and study groups. Resident advisors looked the other way when they suspected illegal sales, reasoning that Adderall was less dangerous than alcohol or other drugs students were using. Campus newspapers ran articles debating the ethics of cognitive enhancement, without questioning whether widespread stimulant use was occurring. The question wasn't whether students were using Adderall, but whether that use constituted cheating, medication, or personal choice about cognitive enhancement. Different user types emerge with distinct patterns and motivations. The desperate pre-med student used Adderall only before major exams, carefully timing doses to maximize performance on tests that would determine medical school admission. The chronic user took it daily for classes, studying, and eventually social situations where focus seemed beneficial. The partier discovered Adderall's recreational properties, using it to drink longer without passing out or to recover from hangovers before exams. The entrepreneur managed multiple campus jobs and extracurricular activities, using stimulants to maintain the inhuman schedules necessary for resume building. All of them believed they were making rational choices about performance optimization, rather than developing substance abuse patterns. Certain majors and programs showed dramatically higher usage rates than campus averages. Pre-medical students faced organic chemistry courses designed to weed out weak candidates before medical school applications. Engineering programs demanded problem sets requiring hours of focused mathematical work. Architecture studios expected students to function on minimal sleep for weeks before project deadlines. These academic environments created perfect conditions for stimulant adoption, because legitimate academic demands exceeded normal human capacity for sustained focus and effort. Students using Adderall weren't looking for unfair advantages, but trying to survive programs that seemed designed to break them. The Greek system became a major distribution channel as fraternity and sorority members with prescriptions supplied entire chapters. Social networks within Greek life facilitated finding pills quickly when needed. Fraternity brothers shared pills before tests with the same casualness they shared beer at parties. Sorority members helped sisters through finals week with Adderall, the way they'd share tampons or makeup. The social trust within these organizations reduced the stigma and risk of transactions. Everyone knew which brothers or sisters had prescriptions and would sell or share. The market operated through friendship networks rather than traditional drug dealer relationships. Athletic teams developed their own complicated relationship with stimulants as performance-conscious students discovered benefits beyond academics. Adderall enhanced workout intensity and focus during practice. Athletes used it to study between training sessions. Some experimented with it before competitions despite potential drug testing. NCAA rules banned stimulants, but enforcement was inconsistent and many athletes with legitimate ADHD diagnoses received therapeutic use exemptions. The exemptions created suspicions that some athletes fabricated symptoms to gain legal access to performance enhancement. Teammates without prescriptions resented those who could use stimulants legally, while everyone else risked suspension. Campus religious and cultural organizations weren't exempt from the trend despite different social dynamics. Christian fellowship groups included pre-med students facing the same organic chemistry demands as everyone else. International students under intense pressure from families invested life savings in American education used Adderall to maximize their limited time at expensive universities. First-generation college students, terrified of failing and confirming relative skepticism about higher education, took whatever help they could find. The drug crossed all social boundaries because academic pressure was universal, even if social circles varied. Study abroad programs exported the phenomenon internationally, as American students brought pills overseas and introduced foreign students to pharmaceutical enhancement. European universities began seeing similar patterns as exchange students shared Adderall with local friends. Students from countries with stricter pharmaceutical regulations stockpiled pills before returning home. American campus culture was spreading globally through study abroad programs and international student populations, carrying Adderall use as part of the package. The drug that transformed American university life was beginning its conquest of higher education worldwide. Price fluctuations revealed market sophistication that would impress economics professors. Regular season prices stayed relatively stable at $5 to $10 per pill. Midterm periods saw prices increase 20–30% as demand spiked. Finals week created sellers' markets where pills commanded $15 to $20 regardless of dosage. Students with prescriptions learned to stockpile pills during low-demand periods and sell when prices peaked. The most entrepreneurial dealers purchased from multiple prescribed students at bulk discounts, then resold individually at retail prices. The campus Adderall economy operated with the efficiency of any unregulated market responding to supply and demand. University administrators remained largely oblivious to the scale of stimulant use despite clear evidence. Campus police rarely investigated Adderall sales since they focused on cocaine, marijuana, and alcohol violations. Health centers saw prescription increases but attributed them to better ADHD awareness rather than strategic diagnosis seeking. Professors noticed students performing better on exams without understanding the pharmaceutical assistance. The institutional incentives favored ignorance since acknowledging widespread stimulant abuse would require difficult interventions and public relations disasters. Everyone involved had reasons to pretend the problem was smaller than it actually was. Anonymous online forums provided unprecedented documentation of the phenomenon, as students shared experiences without fear of consequences. College confidential threads contained detailed discussions of dosing strategies, best times to take pills, methods for approaching prescribed students to buy pills, and techniques for obtaining prescriptions from campus doctors. Students from dozens of universities compared notes on pricing and availability. The forums revealed that this wasn't isolated behavior at a few schools, but a nationwide shift in how students approached academic demands. The collective knowledge accumulated in these spaces created how-to guides, for stimulant use that new students could access before arriving on campus. Parents remained shockingly unaware that their prescribed children were selling medication or that their non-prescribed children were buying it. Students kept parents in the dark about campus stimulant culture, the same way previous generations hid alcohol and marijuana use. Parents heard about their children's improved grades and active campus involvement, without questioning whether pharmaceutical assistance enabled those achievements. The generational divide in drug knowledge worked both ways. Parents who came of age during the cocaine epidemic didn't recognize that stimulant abuse now came in prescription pill form and was considered far less serious by their children. The stage was set for explosive growth that would make early 2000s usage rates seem quaint by comparison. Adderall had established itself as campus infrastructure rather than an underground drug. Students entering college already knew about it from older siblings and friends. The transition to university included learning where to buy pills alongside learning where to eat and study. What began as desperate students seeking academic help had evolved into a comprehensive pharmaceutical culture that transformed how an entire generation approached mental performance and achievement. The drug was everywhere, and everyone knew it. The only question was what happened when millions of college students concluded that succeeding in modern academic environments required chemical enhancement rather than exceptional ability. The neurochemistry that made Adderall the ultimate college drug was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Amphetamine molecules crossed the blood-brain barrier within minutes of ingestion, flooding synapses with dopamine and norepinephrine at concentrations far exceeding natural production. Dopamine receptors throughout the brain's reward and motivation circuits fired continuously, creating artificial interest in tasks that would normally bore students to tears. Reading a textbook on cellular respiration suddenly felt urgent and fascinating. Memorizing organic chemistry reactions became genuinely engaging. The brain's reward system treated every completed homework problem like a significant achievement worth celebrating. Motivation wasn't something students had to manufacture through willpower anymore. The drug made them want to study. Norepinephrine effects transformed physical and mental arousal simultaneously. Heart rate increased slightly, bringing heightened alertness without jittery anxiety if dosing was correct. The prefrontal cortex received enhanced norepinephrine signaling, improving executive function and working memory capacity. Students could hold more information in mind while solving complex problems. Distractions that normally derailed study sessions became easier to ignore. The internal monologue of worries and random thoughts quieted down, replaced by singular focus on the task at hand. Fatigue disappeared for hours even if students had slept poorly the night before. The drug didn't make people smarter, but it made them feel like better versions of themselves. The psychological effects mattered as much as the neurochemical ones. Students on Adderall experienced profound artificial confidence that coloured every aspect of their experience. They felt certain they understood material that might actually confuse them. Test anxiety evaporated because the drug created biochemical certainty that they'd perform well. The imposter syndrome plaguing many college students dissolved temporarily as dopamine floods convinced them they belonged in competitive academic environments. This confidence was entirely artificial, generated by neurotransmitter manipulation rather than actual competence, but it felt real enough to change behaviour. Students who normally procrastinated started assignments immediately. Those who'd avoid difficult material tackled it head-on. The timing of effects created perfect alignment with academic demands. Adderall reached peak plasma concentration 30 minutes to 2 hours after oral administration depending on formulation. Students learned time doses so peak effects coincided with exams or important study sessions. Extended release versions provided 8 to 12 hours of coverage, enough for a full day of classes and evening studying. The drug's duration matched academic schedules as if specifically designed for college life. 4-hour Ritalin required redosing that drew attention and was inconvenient. Adderall lasted through everything students needed to accomplish in a single day. The contrast with normal study methods was stark enough to convert skeptics after single experiences. Without Adderall, studying meant constant battles with motivation, forcing attention back to material after every distraction, struggling through boring sections, taking breaks every 30 minutes. With Adderall, students sat down and worked for hours without noticing time passing. Material that normally required reading 3 times for comprehension made sense on first pass. Practice problems that would take all evening got finished in 2 hours. The drug didn't just improve performance, it transformed the entire subjective experience of academic work from tedious labor into something approaching enjoyable productivity. Users developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for maximizing benefits and minimizing side effects. Taking pills with protein-rich meals slowed absorption, extending duration and reducing the intensity of the peak. Acidic foods and drinks reduced effectiveness, so experienced users avoided orange juice and vitamin C supplements on Adderall days. Magnesium supplements supposedly reduced tolerance buildup, though evidence was mostly anecdotal. Eating became a challenge since appetite suppression was nearly universal, so users forced down calorie-dense smoothies or nuts. Hydration required conscious effort because the drug masked thirst. These workarounds created elaborate rituals around stimulant use that resembled athletic training regimens more than drug abuse. The crash after Adderall wore off created problems that often led to more drug use. As dopamine and norepinephrine levels plummeted back to normal, users experienced irritability, fatigue, and mild depression. The tasks that seemed fascinating 6 hours earlier now looked impossibly boring. Motivation evaporated completely. Students who'd been hyper-focused suddenly couldn't concentrate at all. Many took a second dose in the afternoon or evening to avoid the crash, but that guaranteed insomnia later. Others accepted the crash as the price of enhanced performance, treating it like a hangover that had to be endured. The cycle created its own momentum. Take Adderall to study, crash afterward, need Adderall again to function the next day. Side effects ranged from minor annoyances to serious health concerns, depending on dosage and individual physiology. Nearly everyone experienced appetite suppression that could lead to significant weight loss during heavy use periods. Jaw clenching and teeth grinding damaged dental work and created tension headaches. Increased heart rate and blood pressure were usually mild but occasionally dangerous in people with undiagnosed heart conditions. Some users developed obsessive behaviors, spending 6 hours organizing notes instead of studying or getting stuck on single homework problems while neglecting everything else. The hyper-focus that made Adderall useful could misfire spectacularly, wasting hours on tasks that seemed important only because dopamine was flooding the brain. Sexual side effects surprised users who expected stimulants to enhance everything. Many people experienced reduced libido or difficulty achieving orgasm while on Adderall. Long-term heavy use led to erectile dysfunction in some men. The drug prioritized cognitive performance over other brain functions, essentially reassigning resources away from sex drive toward focus and motivation. Students learned to schedule sexual activity around their dosing schedules, another bizarre adaptation to living on stimulants. The fact that users were willing to accept sexual dysfunction to maintain academic performance revealed how deeply the drug had embedded itself in campus life. Sleep architecture collapsed under regular Adderall use, even when students thought they were managing fine. The drug's half-life meant it stayed active for hours after subjective effects faded. Taking a pill at 8 in the morning meant stimulation persisted until evening, even if users didn't feel wired. REM sleep suffered particularly badly because residual norepinephrine suppressed the brain states necessary for dreaming. Students thought they were sleeping 7 or 8 hours but spent less time in restorative sleep stages. Chronic REM deprivation accumulated over weeks and months, contributing to memory problems, emotional dysregulation, and the paradoxical need for more Adderall to compensate for drug-induced sleep deficits. The psychological dependence developed subtly enough that users didn't recognize it until stopping became impossible. Students initially took Adderall only for major exams, then for regular tests, then for homework, then for classes, then for any academic work, finally for basic functioning. The transition happened gradually as they forgot what normal baseline motivation felt like. Attempting to study without Adderall felt impossibly difficult because brains adapted to artificial dopamine levels by reducing natural production and receptor sensitivity. What users called needing Adderall was partly withdrawal from chronic use, partly psychological dependence on enhanced performance, partly legitimate ADHD symptoms that emerged only after drug use altered brain chemistry. Research comparing Adderall's actual effects to user perceptions revealed a troubling disconnect. Controlled studies showed minimal grade improvement in students without ADHD using stimulants. Some studies found no difference at all between medicated and unmedicated academic performance. The drugs increased study time and perceived understanding without necessarily improving actual learning or test scores. Users consistently believed they performed better on Adderall despite objective evidence showing marginal or non-existent benefits. The confidence and motivation boost felt like improved capability, even when results didn't support that interpretation. Students were essentially addicted to feeling productive rather than actually being more productive. The competitive dynamics created impossible situations where rational individual decisions produced collectively irrational outcomes. When 30% of a class used cognitive enhancement, not using it felt like voluntary disadvantage even if the advantage was mostly psychological. Students who refused Adderall on principle watched peers study longer and project more confidence before exams. Whether the enhanced students actually performed better became irrelevant because the perception of disadvantage was real enough to create pressure to use. The arms race logic was inescapable. Everyone using meant everyone had to use to stay competitive, even though overall academic standards didn't rise, and average performance remained constant. Certain academic contexts proved especially conducive to Adderall dependence. Medical school attracted students who'd used stimulants throughout undergraduate years and faced even more intense demands. Law school finals determined entire semester grades through single exams lasting hours. Graduate programs in STEM fields expected continuous research productivity alongside coursework. Professional programs like pharmacy and nursing combined memorization with clinical responsibilities. These environments created perfect storms of high stakes, massive workload, and cultural acceptance of stimulant use. Students entered programs where Adderall use was normal rather than exceptional, where not using marked you as either privileged enough to succeed naturally or foolish enough to reject available tools. The expansion beyond studying revealed how deeply the drug transformed users' relationship with achievement and effort. Students discovered Adderall helped with job interviews by reducing anxiety and increasing verbal fluency. Graduate school application essays got written in single marathon sessions fueled by amphetamines. Internship projects that should take weeks got completed in days of hyper-focused work. The drug became associated with any situation requiring peak performance rather than just academics. This generalization suggested users had stopped viewing Adderall as ADHD medication and started treating it as a general performance enhancer, applicable to all challenging situations. The psychological line between treatment and enhancement had completely dissolved. Athletic performance enhancement paralleled academic use in troubling ways. Students experimented with taking Adderall before workouts, finding it increased pain tolerance and workout intensity. Endurance athletes used it to push through fatigue during long training runs. Team sport players felt it improved focus and reaction time during games. The appetite suppression helped wrestlers and rowers make weight. These effects technically violated NCL rules, but were difficult to distinguish from legitimate ADHD treatment. The same pill that helped students study was now helping them train, compete, and achieve in every domain of college life. Enhancement had become comprehensive rather than limited to classrooms. Creative and artistic pursuits weren't immune to the enhancement trend despite romance about natural talent and inspiration. Music students practiced longer and more intensely on Adderall. Art majors completed intricate projects with unusual focus. Theatre students memorized lines faster and maintained energy through long rehearsals. Creative writing students produced more pages even if quality was debatable. The drug affected every type of achievement culture valued, not just traditionally academic work. This universality revealed something deeper than students' gaming exams. An entire generation was learning they could feel more capable and confident through chemistry, that achievement didn't require natural ability or even hard work in the traditional sense, just the right pharmaceutical assistance. The normalization reached a point where new students arrived at college already knowing about Adderall and expecting to use it. High school students heard about it from older siblings. Summer orientation programs included informal discussions about where to get pills. First-year students asked prescribed friends for sources before even attending their first class. The drug had become part of the expected college experience, something planned for rather than discovered organically. This anticipatory socialization meant future waves of students would start using Adderall earlier and more systematically than their predecessors who discovered it through trial and error. The pharmaceutical industry watched these developments with careful public disapproval and private satisfaction. Shire issued statements condemning non-medical use, while sales continued growing faster than ADHD diagnosis rates could explain. Company executives understood that diversion drove demand for prescriptions, which drove revenue regardless of where pills ended up. The moral hazard was perfect. Condemn illegal use publicly while profiting from it privately, maintain plausible deniability about why prescription rates were exploding. As long as doctors wrote prescriptions through legitimate channels, what happened to pills afterward wasn't Shire's legal responsibility, even if it was predictable and profitable. Students had discovered the perfect drug for achievement-obsessed culture that demanded constant productivity and peak performance. Adderall made superhuman effort feel effortless, transformed boring work into engaging challenges, and created confidence that seemed to guarantee success. The drug was everywhere, relatively safe compared to alternatives, socially acceptable within student culture, and genuinely effective at producing the subjective experience of enhanced capability. Whether that experience translated to actual improved outcomes was almost beside the point. What mattered was that millions of students believed they needed chemical enhancement to compete, and the pills were readily available to meet that demand. The question wasn't whether Adderall would continue spreading, but whether anything could stop it. The prescription pipeline that flooded campuses with Adderall operated through legitimate medical channels that were either broken by design or working exactly as intended depending on perspective. Campus health centers became de facto pill dispensaries during the 2000s as student demand overwhelmed clinical capacity and diagnostic rigor. A typical university psychiatrist or primary care physician handled 120 patient appointments weekly during peak periods. 50-minute slots were standard for initial ADHD evaluations that supposedly assessed complex neurological conditions affecting attention, impulse control, and executive function. The impossible math meant doctors either spent adequate time with each patient and created month-long waiting lists, or maintained reasonable scheduling by conducting superficial evaluations that met minimum requirements without genuine diagnostic investigation. Students learned the exact script necessary to secure prescriptions through trial and error shared via social networks and online forums. The stories began with childhood attention problems that parents or teachers noticed but never formally diagnosed. Academic struggles intensified in college as coursework became more demanding. Specific symptoms from DSM-4 diagnostic criteria appeared naturally in conversation. Difficulty sustaining attention during lectures, easily distracted by external stimuli, trouble organizing tasks and activities, avoidance of sustained mental effort, forgetfulness in daily activities. The checklist was public information available on dozens of websites. Students memorized symptoms the way they memorize vocabulary for language classes. Campus doctors heard these exact phrases from multiple students daily, but couldn't prove anyone was lying. The diagnostic process offered minimal protection against motivated students seeking prescriptions rather than treatment. Doctors asked about childhood behavior, but few students brought report cards or parent interviews to verify claims. Self-reported symptoms were impossible to falsify without extensive neuropsychological testing that campus health centers couldn't provide. The continuous performance tests and attention assessments that might catch malingerers cost hundreds of dollars and required hours to administer. Insurance rarely covered comprehensive ADHD evaluations. University health services operated on tight budgets that prioritized treating maximum students over thorough individual assessment. The system defaulted toward prescribing because proving someone didn't have ADHD was harder than assuming they did. Doctors faced perverse incentives that encouraged prescription rather than skepticism. Refusing to prescribe to a student who genuinely had ADHD could lead to academic failure, medical board complaints, and liability lawsuits. The medical legal doctrine of patient autonomy meant patients' self-reported symptoms carried enormous weight. Accusing students of fabricating symptoms to obtain drugs was professionally dangerous without ironclad evidence. The worst-case scenario for overprescribing was contributing to stimulant diversion, a problem doctors could rationalize as law enforcement's responsibility rather than theirs. The worst-case scenario for underprescribing was ruining a student's academic career and facing professional consequences. The rational choice was obvious, even if ethically questionable. Many campus physicians recognized they were being systematically deceived, but felt powerless to address it effectively. They saw the same symptom presentations repeated identically by dozens of students. The sudden appearance of ADHD symptoms coinciding with organic chemistry courses or MCAT preparation was suspiciously convenient. Students who'd never sought treatment suddenly developed urgent attention problems right before finals week, yet proving malingering required time and resources unavailable in campus health settings. Some doctors tried requiring comprehensive evaluations before prescribing, creating barriers through cost and inconvenience. Students simply went to private psychiatrists or online telehealth services with lower standards. The doctors who maintained diagnostic integrity lost patients to those who prescribed more freely. The online pharmacy explosion around 2010 demolished whatever diagnostic gatekeeping remained in the system. Telehealth companies recognized that ADHD evaluations conducted via video chat with minimal documentation could generate enormous revenue. Services like EasyMed, QuickScript, and similar platforms offered ADHD consultations for $1,500, far cheaper than traditional psychiatric appointments. The video evaluations lasted 15 to 30 minutes, barely enough time to review symptoms and write prescriptions. These companies prescribe stimulants to 70–90% of patients requesting evaluations, rates far exceeding legitimate ADHD prevalence estimates. The business model worked perfectly: low overhead, high volume, minimal liability since doctors technically followed consultation protocols even if those protocols were deliberately inadequate. Cerebral launched in 2020 as the most brazen example of stimulant prescription as service, growing to 175,000 patients and $300 million revenue within 2 years. The company advertised directly to consumers seeking ADHD treatment, streamlined evaluation processes to maximize throughput, and incentivized clinicians to prescribe rather than decline. Internal metrics tracked prescription rates and flagged doctors who denied too many patients. Clinicians reported pressure to prescribe even when they doubted diagnoses. The company's rapid growth and eventual regulatory crackdown illustrated how thoroughly the medical system had abandoned meaningful oversight of stimulant prescribing. Cerebral represented the logical endpoint of trends developing for decades, treating ADHD medication as a consumer product rather than a controlled substance requiring careful medical supervision. Dunn Health operated similarly, prescribing Adderall to patients in initial 30-minute video consultations with remarkable consistency. The company's advertising emphasized convenience and access rather than diagnostic accuracy. Patients seeking stimulants found welcoming physicians who rarely declined prescription requests. Federal prosecutors eventually charged Dunn's founder with participating in a scheme to distribute Adderall illegally, but only after the company had written hundreds of thousands of prescriptions. The criminal case revealed internal communications showing executives knew physicians were prescribing inappropriately but prioritized growth over compliance. The medical system didn't just fail to prevent pill mills, it provided legal infrastructure for them. Pharmaceutical companies' role in enabling prescription proliferation became clear through their relationships with advocacy organizations and prescribing physicians. Shire donated millions to children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the largest ADHD advocacy group. CHAD promoted expanded ADHD diagnosis, particularly in adults, through educational campaigns that reach physicians and potential patients. The organization's messaging emphasized underdiagnosis and barriers to treatment rather than overdiagnosis and diversion. Critics noted that an advocacy group funded by stimulant manufacturers had obvious conflicts of interest when promoting expanded prescription. CHAD defended the relationship as necessary for patient education and destigmatization. The line between genuine advocacy and pharmaceutical marketing became impossible to distinguish. Continuing medical education programs provided another channel for pharmaceutical influence over prescribing practices. Shire and competitors funded CME courses teaching physicians about adult ADHD recognition and treatment. The courses presented evidence emphasizing ADHD persistence into adulthood and benefits of lifelong medication. Doctors earned required education credits while absorbing pharmaceutical-friendly perspectives on diagnosis and treatment. Studies showed physicians who attended industry-funded CME prescribed more of the sponsoring company's drugs afterward. The correlation wasn't surprising, but the brazenness was. Pharmaceutical companies had successfully embedded themselves into the medical education infrastructure that shaped prescribing behavior. Sales representatives cultivated relationships with high-prescribing physicians through office visits, free lunches, and sponsored conferences. Doctors who wrote numerous Adderall prescriptions received more attention from reps bearing samples, promotional materials, and invitations to speaking engagements. The company tracked prescribing patterns and allocated sales resources toward physicians most likely to increase market share. This created financial incentives for doctors to prescribe Shire products, even without explicit quid pro quo arrangements. The entire system rewarded high prescribing and penalized diagnostic caution. Medical professional organizations failed to establish meaningful oversight as prescriptions exploded. The American Psychiatric Association published treatment guidelines emphasizing careful evaluation and monitoring, but guidelines had no enforcement mechanisms. State medical boards investigated the most egregious cases of overprescribing, but lacked resources to monitor thousands of physicians writing millions of prescriptions annually. The Drug Enforcement Administration set manufacturing quotas based on projected medical need, but pharmaceutical companies successfully lobbied to increase quotas year after year as demand climbed. Each regulatory body could point to its efforts while the overall system continued producing more prescriptions than legitimate need could possibly justify. Insurance companies inadvertently enabled prescription proliferation by covering brief evaluations but not comprehensive testing. A 50-minute appointment with a questionnaire cost $150, $200, and was routinely covered. Neuropsychological testing costing $500 to $3,000 faced coverage denials or required extensive prior authorization. Economic incentives pushed doctors toward quick evaluations and prescriptions rather than thorough assessment. Patients seeking legitimacy for pre-existing drug use found it cheaper and faster to get prescriptions than to verify they actually had ADHD. The system optimized for volume over accuracy because insurance reimbursement structures made quality more expensive than quantity. The college-to-workplace pipeline ensured prescription growth extended beyond campus as students graduated and entered professional life. Young adults who'd used Adderall throughout college weren't going to stop just because they received diplomas. They developed psychological and possibly physical dependence on stimulants for performance. Their brains had adapted to artificial dopamine levels, making unmedicated baseline feel like dysfunction. Graduating didn't cure their acquired drug dependence, but it did complicate prescription access since adult ADHD was more controversial than childhood cases, and workplace doctors were more skeptical than campus physicians. Recent graduates employed increasingly creative strategies to maintain prescriptions post-college. Some continued seeing campus doctors during transition periods. Others sought psychiatrists known for readily diagnosing adult ADHD through online reviews and friend recommendations. The most sophisticated approach involves seeking evaluation before graduation, so existing prescriptions transferred smoothly to post-college providers. Telehealth services again provided backup for those unable to find accommodating local doctors. The pharmaceutical infrastructure that served college students expanded to serve young professionals, experiencing the same performance pressures in career contexts. Workplace culture amplified demand for stimulants, as competitive white-collar jobs demanded performance that exceeded normal human capacity. Management consulting firms expected analysts to work 80-hour weeks. Investment banking associates regularly pulled all-nighters completing financial models. Tech companies celebrated engineers who coded continuously for days during product launches. These environments were designed by and for people using performance enhancement, whether through Adderall or other means. New employees who tried competing without stimulants often failed or burned out within months. The message was clear: use enhancement or leave the industry. The medical system's complicity extended to these workplace realities through physician willingness to prescribe for productivity rather than disorder. Doctors treating young professionals in competitive industries understood their patients weren't coming in for ADHD treatment primarily. They wanted chemical assistance maintaining inhuman work schedules. Many physicians, particularly those in private practice serving affluent clients, pragmatically provided prescriptions while maintaining the ADHD fiction required by prescribing regulations. The social contract was simple. Patients claimed they had attention deficits. doctors documented symptoms suggesting ADHD, both parties understood the real purpose was performance enhancement for career advancement. Prescription rates among adults aged 20-39 tripled between 2006 and 2011, growth that couldn't reflect improved diagnosis of lifelong conditions. The timing coincided perfectly with the first wave of college students who'd used Adderall throughout undergraduate years entering the workforce. These young adults hadn't suddenly developed ADHD in their 20s. They developed dependence on stimulants during college and sought continued access after graduation. The medical system accommodated this demand by accepting adult ADHD as a legitimate diagnosis, even when symptoms suspiciously appeared during career-critical periods. The DEA attempted intervention through various enforcement actions, but struggled against the scale of the problem. High-profile raids on pill mills generated headlines without significantly impacting overall prescription rates. Reducing manufacturing quotas led to shortages affecting legitimate patients, while illegal markets simply increased prices. The agency found itself fighting a war on multiple fronts: pharmaceutical companies lobbying to increase quotas, patient advocacy groups claiming medication access barriers, physicians arguing for prescription autonomy, and millions of Americans obtaining prescriptions through technically legal processes that collectively constituted a massive stimulant distribution network. By 2015, American doctors wrote approximately 16 million Adderall prescriptions annually, with the majority going to adults rather than children. The number represented remarkable success in resurrecting amphetamines from their 1970s collapse. The medical system that supposedly restricted stimulants through Schedule II classification was actually facilitating their distribution on a scale exceeding the diet pill era. The only difference was that current prescriptions came with ADHD diagnoses providing medical legitimacy. Whether that distinction was meaningful or merely semantic depended on whether you believed the millions of Americans taking stimulants genuinely had attention disorders or had learned to game a diagnostic system designed to be gamed. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as pharmaceutical companies, prescribing physicians, patient advocacy groups, and most patients wanted it to work. Pills flowed freely to anyone willing to claim appropriate symptoms and pay for brief consultations. Doctors prescribed with minimal liability risk. Pharmaceutical companies generated billions in revenue. Patients got the performance enhancement they sought with medical legitimacy. The only losers were those concerned about mass stimulant use, prescription drug abuse, or the integrity of psychiatric diagnosis. But those concerns carried little weight against the combined force of patient demand, physician cooperation, pharmaceutical marketing, and cultural acceptance of chemical performance enhancement. The medical system had become complicit not through failure, but through success at satisfying everyone's interests, except those who thought widespread stimulant use might actually be a problem worth solving. The emergency room visits began appearing in medical databases around 2005 as the first wave of heavy Adderall users hit critical thresholds of chronic stimulant abuse. A typical case involved a college student arriving at 3 a.m. with heart palpitations, chest pain, and overwhelming anxiety after taking double or triple their normal dose to complete a major project. Emergency physicians initially treated these as isolated incidents involving students who'd foolishly exceeded prescribed amounts. Then the cases multiplied. By 2010, emergency departments near major universities were seeing multiple amphetamine-related admissions weekly. The presentations varied but shared common themes: cardiovascular symptoms, severe anxiety, panic attacks, psychotic episodes, and complications from mixing stimulants with alcohol or other drugs. Amphetamine-related emergency visits tripled nationally between 2005 and 2015 according to data from the Drug Abuse Warning Network. The 23,000 annual visits in 2005 climbed to nearly 70,000 by 2015. Young adults aged 18 to 25 accounted for the largest share of this increase. The statistics captured only the most severe cases where students actually sought emergency care. Countless others experienced frightening symptoms but avoided hospitals out of fear that medical records would affect their academic standing or prescription access. The documented cases represented the tip of a much larger problem playing out in dorm rooms and apartments, where students self-managed dangerous side effects. Fatal outcomes were rare but devastating when they occurred. A University of Wisconsin student died in 2009 after combining Adderall with alcohol and cocaine during extended partying. An MIT sophomore suffered a heart attack in 2011 during finals week after taking massive doses to study continuously for 3 days. These deaths made local news but rarely received national attention because the victims' families often prevented details from becoming public. The scattered fatalities suggested larger patterns that never fully emerged into public consciousness. For every death, dozens of students experienced near misses that changed nothing about their drug use afterward. Cardiovascular complications emerged as the most serious physical risk for chronic high-dose users. Adderall increased heart rate and blood pressure consistently, placing stress on cardiac tissue over time. Students with undiagnosed congenital heart defects face particularly high risks. One case involved a Northwestern athlete who'd taken Adderall since freshman year and suffered a stroke at 23. His prescription was legitimate, his usage was within prescribed limits, and his congenital arteriovenous malformation was unknown before the hemorrhage. The combination killed him. Whether Adderall caused the stroke or merely contributed became a moot point to his family. Stimulant-induced psychosis appeared in a significant minority of heavy users, producing symptoms that mimicked schizophrenia during active phases. Students experienced paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and disorganized thinking after extended high-dose use or sleep deprivation. One Duke student became convinced that classmates were conspiring against him after 4 days of continuous studying on Adderall. He barricaded himself in his room and required psychiatric hospitalization. The psychotic episode resolved within a week of stopping stimulants, but he'd withdrawn from school and lost his scholarship by then. His case wasn't unique. Campus counseling centers across the country saw similar presentations as students pushed past the limits of safe stimulant use. The addiction trap closed slowly enough that users didn't recognize entrapment until escape required serious effort. Tolerance developed predictably as brains adapted to chronic dopamine flooding by reducing natural dopamine production and receptor sensitivity. The dose that initially produced 4 hours of focused productivity eventually delivered 2 hours of minimal benefit. Users increased doses to maintain effects, accelerating tolerance and dependence. Eventually, students found themselves taking Adderall just to feel normal rather than enhanced. Stopping produced withdrawal symptoms including severe fatigue, depression, inability to focus, and hypersomnia lasting weeks or months. These symptoms often resembled ADHD, making it impossible to determine whether users had genuine attention disorders or drug-induced dysfunction. Physical dependence was only part of the addiction picture. Psychological dependence became more problematic as students forgot what unmedicated baseline capability felt like. They attributed every academic success to Adderall, and feared any achievement without pharmaceutical assistance was impossible. The drug became intertwined with identity and self-worth. Students believed themselves incapable of completing college without chemical enhancement. This belief was often self-fulfilling because brains adapted to chronic stimulant exposure didn't function optimally when drugs were withdrawn. Users had created the very disability they feared by training their brains to operate on artificial dopamine levels. Shortage crises erupted periodically starting around 2011 as demand outstripped DEA manufacturing quotas and pharmaceutical production capacity. Students with legitimate prescriptions arrived at pharmacies to find no Adderall in stock for weeks or months. The shortages created desperate situations as finals approached, and prescribed users couldn't access their medication. Some bought from illegal dealers at inflated prices. Others switched to Ritalin or other alternatives that didn't work identically. Campus health centers fielded hundreds of panicked calls from students, terrified they couldn't function academically without their prescriptions. The shortages revealed how thoroughly dependent millions had become on continuous stimulant access. The black market responded to shortages with predictable price increases and questionable product quality. Pills that normally sold for $5 commanded $20 or more during shortage periods. Dealers with stockpiles made extraordinary profits. The desperation also created opportunities for counterfeit pills containing unknown substances. Students buying from unfamiliar sources risked ingesting methamphetamine, research chemicals, or entirely inert pills. Several overdoses occurred from counterfeit pills containing excessive amphetamine concentrations. The pharmaceutical supply chain's failure pushed users toward unregulated markets, with significantly higher risks. Mental health deterioration accompanied chronic stimulant use in ways that weren't always obvious initially. Anxiety disorders emerged or worsened as students became accustomed to artificially elevated norepinephrine levels. Panic attacks became common. Social anxiety increased when not medicated because normal interpersonal situations felt overwhelming compared to the artificial confidence Adderall provided. Depression developed through multiple mechanisms: chronic dopamine depletion during off periods, sleep deprivation accumulation, and psychological dependence creating learned helplessness. Students who'd started taking Adderall to treat one problem found themselves developing several new ones. Anhedonia represented one of the cruelest consequences of long-term stimulant abuse. Chronic dopamine flooding trained brains to require artificial stimulation for experiencing pleasure or motivation. Users couldn't enjoy normally pleasurable activities without being medicated. Food tasted bland, music sounded flat, social interactions felt empty. Even previously beloved hobbies became boring and pointless. This emotional numbness extended to relationships as romantic partners complained that users seemed emotionally absent except when on stimulants. The drug that initially enhanced life was slowly destroying capacity for natural enjoyment. Sleep architecture destruction accumulated across years of use, even when students thought they were managing fine. Adderall suppressed REM sleep and altered slow-wave sleep patterns, essential for memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Chronic users spent years sleeping 6 or 7 hours per night without achieving restorative sleep. The deficits accumulated into serious cognitive and psychiatric problems. Memory formation suffered despite users believing Adderall enhanced learning. Emotional regulation deteriorated as brains missed critical REM periods necessary for processing emotional experiences. Students became irritable, emotionally labile, and prone to mood swings that damaged relationships and academic performance. Research papers began documenting cognitive costs that contradicted the enhancement narrative. Studies showed decreased creativity in regular stimulant users compared to non-users. Problem-solving flexibility declined with chronic use. Memory formation was actually impaired rather than enhanced when students used Adderall during learning. The drug improved attention and study time but damaged the encoding processes necessary for long-term retention. Students were working harder to learn less effectively. They attributed poor exam performance to insufficient studying rather than drug-induced memory problems, creating cycles where more Adderall use attempted to fix problems caused by Adderall. The post-graduation addiction crisis hit thousands of young adults who'd maintained stimulant use through college only to face difficulties accessing prescriptions afterward. Professional careers rarely offered the same structural supports for managing dependence that universities provided. Employers weren't as forgiving as professors about performance fluctuations. Health insurance through work often covered less comprehensive psychiatric care than student health plans. Young adults found themselves addicted to controlled substances with diminishing legitimate access and increasing consequences for impaired performance. Many turned to illegal sources or continued gaming the medical system through sympathetic doctors. Weight loss spiraled into eating disorders for some users, particularly women already struggling with body image concerns. Adderall's appetite suppressant effects enabled dangerous restriction patterns. Users could skip meals without feeling hungry, creating caloric deficits that led to rapid weight loss. Initially, they celebrated losing a few pounds. Then the weight loss became compulsive. The stimulant use that started for academic performance evolved into disordered eating maintained by pharmaceutical appetite suppression. Treatment providers struggled with cases where stimulant abuse and eating disorders were completely entangled, making recovery from either condition more difficult. Relationship damage accumulated as partners and family members watched loved ones become irritable, emotionally unavailable, and obsessed with productivity. Students prioritized studying over social connections, cancelled plans when crashing from stimulants, and became defensive when questioned about drug use. Close relationships require emotional availability that chronic stimulant users couldn't provide consistently. Romantic partners left. Friendships dissolved. Family relationships became strained as parents noticed concerning changes without understanding their cause. The isolation deepened dependence as students lost social support networks that might have helped them quit. Professional consequences occasionally emerged when students transitioned into careers with drug testing requirements. Law enforcement, federal government positions, and some healthcare jobs required screening that detected amphetamines. Students who'd used Adderall throughout college suddenly faced test failures and job offer withdrawals. Having a prescription provided some protection, but not always. Security clearance investigations questioned stimulant use even when prescribed. The career paths these students had worked toward became inaccessible specifically because of the drug they'd used to achieve academic qualifications for those careers. Neurological research revealed concerning changes in brain structure among chronic stimulant users. Imaging studies showed reduced grey matter volume in several brain regions, including areas governing executive function and emotional regulation. The changes appeared partially reversible with sustained abstinence, but full recovery took years if it occurred at all. Whether these structural changes translated to functional impairment remained debated, but the evidence suggested that chronic Adderall use was physically altering brains in ways that might have permanent consequences. The generation that had treated stimulants as harmless study aids was unwittingly conducting a mass experiment in long-term amphetamine exposure. Cardiac screening studies among young adults with stimulant histories revealed alarming rates of subclinical cardiovascular changes. Echocardiograms showed slightly enlarged left ventricles and subtle valvular abnormalities in heavy users. Blood pressure patterns suggested early hypertensive changes in people in their 20s. These findings didn't constitute immediate health crises but indicated chronic cardiovascular stress that would likely produce clinical disease decades earlier than in non-users. Students taking Adderall to enhance college performance might be trading years of a later life for marginal academic gains. The immune system dysfunction observed in chronic stimulant users received less attention but created practical problems. Students on Adderall got sick more frequently than peers, experiencing longer recovery times from common infections. Sleep deprivation and chronic stress from stimulant use suppressed immune function. Minor illnesses that should resolve in days lingered for weeks. The reduced immune function made users more vulnerable during flu season and COVID-19 pandemic. Students missed classes due to illness more often, despite using drugs supposedly designed to improve academic performance. Dental problems emerged as unexpected consequences of chronic use. Jaw clenching and teeth grinding damaged enamel and caused temporomandibular joint disorders. Dry mouth from reduced saliva production increased cavity risk. Students in their 20s developed dental problems typically seen decades later. The cosmetic and health costs were significant. Multiple crowns, root canals, and TMJ treatments cost thousands of dollars. Appearance changes from dental damage affected social confidence and professional opportunities. Few students considered that study drugs might ruin their teeth. Financial devastation struck users who developed serious dependence without legitimate prescriptions. Buying Adderall at street prices of $5 to $20 per pill added up quickly when consumption reached daily or multiple times daily. A moderate habit cost $150 or $300 monthly. Heavy users spent over $1,000 monthly on pills. College students and recent graduates rarely had that kind of disposable income. Some took on credit card debt to fund stimulant use. Others stole from roommates or family members. The financial stress created additional problems compounding those directly caused by drug use. Legal consequences remained relatively rare since simple possession penalties for prescription drugs were generally minimal, but they occurred frequently enough to ruin some lives. Students caught selling Adderall faced felony drug distribution charges carrying potential prison time. A Cornell student selling pills to fund his own use received 5 years probation and a felony conviction that destroyed his medical school applications. Campus police occasionally crack down on dealers, making examples of high-visibility arrests that generated temporary fear before market dynamics returned to normal. The legal risks were real, but rarely enough to deter users who believed the academic benefits justified the dangers. The dark side of Adderall use was accumulating evidence but changing very little about campus culture or medical prescribing. Emergency room visits mounted. Research documented cognitive harms. Students developed serious dependencies. None of it seemed to matter. The next generation of freshmen arrived expecting to use Adderall just as their predecessors had. The medical system continued prescribing to anyone who claimed appropriate symptoms. The fundamental dynamics driving mass stimulant use remained unchallenged despite mounting evidence of harm. Something more dramatic than research papers and occasional tragedies would be required to shift the trajectory. That shift was coming, but not before millions more young people experimented with cognitive enhancement through amphetamines, and a substantial portion of them paid serious prices for those experiments. The money behind Adderall's dominance revealed pharmaceutical capitalism at its most efficient and morally ambiguous. Shire's ADHD medication portfolio generated peak annual revenue of $2.3 billion before Adderall's patent expiration, making it one of the most profitable psychiatric drugs in history. The company had transformed a rebranded obesity medication into a cash machine by identifying an expandable diagnosis, marketing aggressively to doctors and patients, and creating cultural acceptance of lifelong stimulant use. Wall Street analysts celebrated Shire's execution as a masterclass in pharmaceutical strategy. The fact that this success relied on millions of people taking controlled substances daily barely registered as a concern in quarterly earnings calls. Patent expiration in 2009 for instant-release Adderall and 2018 for Adderall XR should have collapsed profit margins as generic competitors flooded the market. Instead, the transition created a more robust and distributed stimulant economy. Teva Pharmaceuticals released the first generic Adderall in 2012 after years of legal battles with Shire over patent extensions and exclusivity periods. Actavis, Sandoz, and Bar Pharmaceuticals followed rapidly with their own versions. Generic prices dropped to 1/3 of brand name costs. making pills more accessible to students who'd been priced out of the market. The increased affordability expanded the user base rather than merely shifting existing users to cheaper alternatives. The generic explosion paradoxically increased total market size while reducing per-pill profits. More manufacturers meant more total production capacity unconstrained by single-company limitations. Pharmacy shelves stocked multiple generic versions alongside brand-name Adderall, ensuring supply rarely disappeared completely even during shortage periods. Students who'd avoided asking for prescriptions due to cost found that generic versions cost less than their coffee habits. Insurance companies preferentially covered generics, reducing patient copays to $10 or $15 monthly. The financial barrier that might have limited use was systematically eliminated through generic competition. Pharmaceutical marketing evolved beyond traditional doctor-focused strategies into direct patient cultivation through digital channels. Companies couldn't legally advertise Schedule II controlled substances directly to consumers, but they could fund educational content about ADHD that appeared in search results when people researched symptoms. Sponsored articles on health websites discussed adult ADHD under diagnosis using statistics provided by pharmaceutical-funded research. Social media influencers partnered with ADHD advocacy organizations to share personal stories of diagnosis and treatment, never mentioning the pharmaceutical funding behind those organizations. The marketing had become so sophisticated that most targets never recognized they were being marketed to at all. Shire's response to patent expiration demonstrated the pharmaceutical industry's standard playbook for maintaining profits when exclusivity ended. The company had already launched Vyvanse in 2007 as Adderall's planned successor. Vyvanse used lisdexamphetamine, a prodrug that required enzymatic conversion in the body to become active dextroamphetamine. The chemistry created a supposedly abuse-deterrent formulation that couldn't be crushed and snorted effectively. Shire marketed this property as a safety advantage, while the real goal was patent protection, extending decades beyond Adderall's expiration. Vyvanse cost 3 to 4 times more than generic Adderall, but offered fresh intellectual property that competitors couldn't copy. The Vyvanse strategy worked spectacularly well, despite questionable clinical advantages over cheaper alternatives. Doctors prescribed it preferentially to new patients while continuing existing patients on Adderall generics. Parents concerned about abuse potential switched their children to the more expensive option. College students with generous insurance coverage obtained Vyvanse prescriptions that cost them minimal copays, while insurers paid premium prices. By 2018, Vyvanse generated $2.1 billion annually for Shire, completely replacing lost Adderall revenue. The transition demonstrated that pharmaceutical companies could maintain profit margins indefinitely by developing successor drugs that offered marginal improvements while securing new patents. Takeda Pharmaceutical acquired Shire in 2019 for $62 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical mergers in history. The acquisition was motivated substantially by Shire's ADHD medication portfolio, including Vyvanse and several other stimulants in development. Investment analysts justified the massive price tag by projecting continued growth in ADHD diagnosis rates and medication usage. Takeda was essentially betting that demand for prescription stimulants would keep expanding for decades. The bet seemed solid given trends showing no signs of reversing. An entire generation had been conditioned to view chemical cognitive enhancement as normal, creating a permanent customer base that would likely maintain stimulant use throughout their lives. The ADHD industry extended far beyond pharmaceutical manufacturing into a comprehensive ecosystem of testing, diagnosis, coaching, and support services. Companies offered online ADHD assessments that cost $5,200 and provided documentation patients could take to doctors. ADHD coaches charged $100–300 per hour to help clients with organization and productivity strategies. Continuing education providers offered courses teaching physicians about adult ADHD diagnosis, funded by pharmaceutical companies with financial stakes in expanded prescribing. The total ADHD industry reached $17 billion annually by 2020, with pharmaceutical sales representing only part of the economic activity generated by the diagnosis. Testing companies developed increasingly sophisticated ADHD assessments that looked rigorous while maintaining high positive diagnosis rates. Computerized continuous performance tests measured attention and impulsivity through repetitive tasks. These tests had face validity and generated impressive-looking reports with graphs and percentile scores. However, the normative data and diagnostic cutoffs were often calibrated to identify maximum potential cases rather than only clear-cut pathology. A student performing at the 25th percentile on attention measures might receive an ADHD diagnosis, despite 1/4 of the population scoring similarly by definition. The tests provided scientific veneer for diagnoses that remained fundamentally subjective. Pharmacy benefit managers played crucial roles in stimulant economics through formulary decisions that shaped prescribing patterns. PBMs negotiated rebates with pharmaceutical companies in exchange for preferred formulary placement. Shire paid substantial rebates to ensure Vyvanse appeared on insurance formularies despite its higher cost than generic alternatives. These rebates were theoretically passed to insurers and patients through lower premiums, but actual savings were opaque. The system created perverse incentives where PBMs profited more from expensive drugs with large rebates than from cheaper generics without rebates. Patients encountered formulary restrictions forcing them towards specific medications based on PBM negotiations rather than clinical appropriateness. Mail-order pharmacy operations specialized in ADHD medication distribution, processing millions of prescriptions monthly through centralized facilities. These operations achieved economies of scale impossible for traditional retail pharmacies. Automated dispensing systems filled prescriptions faster and cheaper than pharmacists counting pills manually. The efficiency was impressive but created distance between patients and pharmacists, who might notice concerning patterns. Retail pharmacists often knew their regular customers and could identify potential abuse or diversion. Mail-order systems processed prescriptions as data points without human judgment applying context. The industrialization of ADHD medication distribution optimized for volume and cost, but sacrificed oversight. Manufacturers' assistance programs provided free or reduced-cost medications to patients who couldn't afford them, creating goodwill while serving strategic purposes. These programs kept patients on branded drugs instead of switching to generics when facing financial hardship. A patient receiving free Vyvanse through manufacturer assistance was more likely to continue that medication when their financial situation improved rather than switching to cheaper alternatives. The programs also generated positive public relations, allowing companies to claim they prioritized patient access over profits. The reality was more complex. Assistance programs cost pharmaceutical companies relatively little, while building brand loyalty worth far more than the donated medication. Direct-to-consumer advertising restrictions on Schedule II drugs were circumvented through disease awareness campaigns that mentioned no specific medications. Television commercials showed actors struggling to focus at work or school, then listed ADHD symptoms and encouraged viewers to talk with their doctors. The ads never mentioned Adderall or Vyvanse by name, technically complying with regulations while obviously promoting those companies' products. Sophisticated viewers recognized the pharmaceutical funding behind these campaigns, but most people absorbed the messaging without considering its commercial purpose. The net effect was the same as direct advertising: increased patient demand for specific medications. Medical conferences became pharmaceutical showcases where companies funded lavish events promoting their ADHD medications. Shire and later Takeda sponsored major psychiatry conferences, paying for exhibition space, satellite symposiums, and prestigious speaking slots. Physicians attended educational sessions led by key opinion leaders who happened to be on pharmaceutical company payrolls. The presentations covered legitimate medical topics, but invariably emphasized the sponsoring company's products in favorable lights. Attendees received free meals, conference materials, and continuing education credits while absorbing pharmaceutical-friendly perspectives. The conferences blurred lines between education and marketing so thoroughly that the distinction became meaningless. Key opinion leaders represented another crucial element in pharmaceutical marketing strategy. These respected physicians and researchers received consulting fees, speaking honorariums, and research grants from stimulant manufacturers. Their published papers and conference presentations shaped medical opinion about ADHD diagnosis and treatment. They weren't required to promote specific drugs explicitly, but their pharmaceutical relationships influenced their perspectives in subtle ways. Studies showed that physicians with financial ties to pharmaceutical companies were more likely to have favorable opinions about those companies' products. The opinion leaders weren't corrupt in any obvious sense, but their economic incentives aligned with expanded stimulant prescribing. Research funding from pharmaceutical sources shaped the scientific literature in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Companies funded studies designed to show their medications in favorable lights, while avoiding research that might reveal problems. Negative results were often not published, creating publication bias in the literature. Meta-analyses and systematic reviews based on published studies showed pharmaceutical products more favorably than the complete evidence would support. Academic researchers depended on pharmaceutical funding for their careers, creating pressure to maintain good relationships with industry sponsors. The corruption was systemic rather than individual, making it nearly impossible to separate genuinely independent science from commercially motivated research. The compounding pharmacy industry discovered profitable niches, creating customized stimulant formulations for patients who claimed standard medications didn't work properly. These pharmacies mixed their own amphetamine combinations, adjusted dosing schedules, and added other active ingredients supposedly tailored to individual needs. Insurance rarely covered compounded medications, so patients paid cash at premium prices. Some compounding operations were legitimate medical services for patients with genuine, unusual needs. Others were essentially boutique stimulant manufacturers, serving wealthy clients willing to pay extra for perceived customization. The industry operated with minimal oversight compared to traditional pharmaceutical manufacturing. Pharmacy benefit data revealed troubling patterns when analysts examined prescription trends. Certain prescribers wrote stimulant prescriptions at rates 10 times higher than their peers. Some pharmacies filled ADHD prescriptions almost exclusively, suggesting they'd become de facto stimulant distribution centers. Specific zip codes showed prescription rates far exceeding others with similar demographics. These statistical anomalies indicated systematic overprescribing and potential diversion, but regulatory action was rare. The data existed in corporate databases but rarely reached law enforcement or medical boards with authority to investigate. Privacy regulations and business interests prevented data sharing that might reveal the scale of inappropriate prescribing. Wall Street's perspective on the ADHD medication market emphasized growth potential rather than medical necessity. Analyst reports projected continued expansion based on increasing diagnosis rates and longer treatment durations. The introduction of adult ADHD as a legitimate diagnosis opened a massive new market. Investors celebrated pharmaceutical companies that successfully captured market share in this growing segment. Quarterly earnings calls focused on prescription trends and market penetration rather than patient outcomes. The financial markets treated ADHD medication like any other growth product, blind to or unconcerned about the implications of millions of people taking controlled substances primarily for performance rather than disease treatment. Generic manufacturers eventually developed their own sophisticated business strategies beyond simply undercutting brand name prices. They created authorized generics with pharmaceutical partners, capturing profit margins while maintaining lower prices than branded versions. They developed their own abuse deterrent formulations and extended release technologies that could be patented separately. The distinction between generic and brand name companies blurred as generics pursued innovation and branded companies produced authorized generics. The result was a complex pharmaceutical ecosystem where multiple companies profited from stimulant distribution through overlapping strategies. The business behind Adderall revealed an economic machine that had aligned incentives of pharmaceutical companies, physicians, pharmacies, testing companies, advocacy organizations, and patients themselves toward continued expansion of stimulant use. No individual actor was uniquely responsible because the system worked through collective action, producing outcomes no one explicitly designed. Pharmaceutical companies pursued legitimate profit in legal ways. Doctors prescribed to patients who reported symptoms. Patients sought treatment for struggles they genuinely experienced. Yet the aggregate result was mass distribution of powerful stimulants to millions of people who might not have needed them, creating dependence while generating enormous profits. The machine was self-sustaining because everyone involved benefited from its continued operation, except the subset of users who developed serious problems, and they were dispersed and silent enough not to threaten the overall system's stability. The COVID-19 pandemic paradoxically accelerated stimulant prescribing by demolishing whatever remained of diagnostic gatekeeping through in-person evaluations. Telehealth regulations relaxed in March 2020 to maintain medical access during lockdowns, allowing doctors to prescribe controlled substances after video consultations without ever meeting patients physically. The policy intended to help legitimate patients continue treatment transformed into an expressway for anyone seeking Adderall prescriptions. Online platforms that had operated in regulatory grey areas suddenly enjoyed explicit permission to conduct business nationally. The timing couldn't have been better for companies built on the premise that ADHD evaluation could be reduced to 30-minute video calls. DunHealth launched in 2019 but found its perfect moment during pandemic isolation. The company advertised aggressively on social media targeting young adults, struggling with remote work and online learning. Ads promised ADHD evaluations within days and prescriptions after a single consultation. The business model worked exactly as designed. Patients paid $79 for initial consultation, then $199 monthly for ongoing prescription management and unlimited messaging with providers. Dun grew from essentially 0 to 50,000 patients within 18 months. The company prescribed stimulants to approximately 90% of patients seeking evaluation, a rate so high it suggested the consultation served primarily to satisfy legal prescription requirements rather than genuine diagnosis. Cerebral followed a similar trajectory with even more spectacular growth and eventual implosion. The company raised $462 million in venture capital based on projections of massive ADHD treatment market expansion. Cerebral spent heavily on Instagram and TikTok advertising, targeting college students and young professionals with messages about undiagnosed adult ADHD. The marketing worked brilliantly, attracting 175,000 patients by early 2022. Internal metrics tracked provider prescription rates, and management pressured clinicians who declined too many patients. Nurses and therapists reported being told to focus on growth rather than careful diagnosis. The company operated as a prescription fulfillment service disguised as legitimate mental health care. The crash came in 2022 when Cerebral's own pharmacist flagged unusual prescribing patterns to the DEA. Kyle Robertson, the pharmacist, reported that over 70% of Cerebral's stimulant prescriptions appeared medically inappropriate based on cursory evaluations and patterns suggesting diversion. The DEA launched investigations. Major pharmacy chains including CVS, Walmart, and Kroger refused to fill Cerebral prescriptions, citing concerns about legitimacy. The company's leadership recognized the crisis and attempted damage control by stopping all stimulant prescriptions immediately. Thousands of patients who developed dependence suddenly lost access to their medication, creating a different humanitarian crisis. Cerebral laid off most staff and essentially imploded within months. Dunn Health faced similar scrutiny as federal prosecutors in California charged founder Ruthia He in 2023 with participating in a conspiracy to distribute Adderall illegally. The indictment alleged that Dunn prescribed stimulants with minimal evaluation to patients who didn't need them, knowing that many would divert or abuse the medication. Prosecutors had evidence of internal communications showing executives were aware of inadequate medical oversight but prioritized growth. The criminal charges represented the first major federal prosecution of telehealth executives for stimulant overprescribing, signaling a dramatic shift in regulatory tolerance for online pill mills. State medical boards accelerated investigations into physicians who prescribed stimulants at suspiciously high rates through telehealth platforms. California, Texas, and New York medical boards suspended or revoked licenses of doctors who'd written thousands of stimulant prescriptions monthly after brief video consultations. The investigations revealed that some physicians prescribed to 95% of patients they evaluated rates incompatible with legitimate diagnostic practice. One California psychiatrist had prescribed stimulants to over 12,000 patients in 2 years through Dunn Health, averaging 15 prescriptions daily. The volume was physically impossible to accomplish with adequate clinical care, proving the consultations were superficial at best. The lawsuits began piling up in 2022 and 2023 as families whose children died or suffered serious complications from Adderall sued pharmaceutical companies, telehealth platforms, and prescribing physicians. Wrongful death claims allege that companies had knowingly facilitated stimulant abuse through inadequate safeguards. Product liability suits claimed pharmaceutical manufacturers downplayed addiction risks in their marketing. Medical malpractice cases targeted doctors who prescribed after cursory evaluations. The litigation created potential billion-dollar liabilities that made insurers and investors reassess the ADHD treatment industry's risk profile. Class action lawsuits emerged from patients who claimed they'd been systematically addicted to stimulants through deceptive marketing and inadequate medical supervision. The cases alleged that pharmaceutical companies and telehealth platforms conspired to expand stimulant prescribing beyond legitimate medical need, creating dependence while profiting from continued prescriptions. These suits faced significant legal challenges since patients had actively sought prescriptions and given informed consent. However, plaintiffs argued that consent was invalid when based on pharmaceutical marketing that systematically minimized addiction risks and exaggerated benefits. The legal theories were novel, but gained traction as evidence of corporate misconduct accumulated. Cultural conversation about Adderall shifted noticeably around 2022 as Gen Z users began sharing addiction stories and recovery journeys on social media. TikTok videos with millions of views documented the process of becoming dependent on ADHD medication, struggling to function without it, and the difficult path to quitting. These narratives contrasted sharply with earlier content celebrating Adderall as a productivity hack. Young adults who'd started using stimulants in high school were now old enough to recognize long-term consequences and articulate concerns about dependence. The cultural tide was turning from acceptance towards skepticism, though actual usage rates hadn't declined significantly yet. The shortage crisis intensified through 2022-2024 as DEA manufacturing quotas failed to keep pace with legitimate and illegitimate demand. Patients with genuine ADHD struggled to fill prescriptions for months. The shortages were blamed variously on DEA quota restrictions, manufacturing capacity limits, and demand exceeding supply. The real cause was decades of prescription growth creating unsustainable demand for controlled substances. The DEA had increased quotas annually for years but finally drew a line, refusing to authorize production increases that would effectively legalize mass stimulant distribution. Pharmaceutical companies and patient advocacy groups lobbied aggressively to raise quotas while the DEA faced criticism from all sides. Universities began implementing stricter policies around ADHD diagnosis and medication management during this period. Some campuses required comprehensive neuropsychological testing before prescribing stimulants to students who hadn't been diagnosed previously. Others instituted monitoring programs for students receiving stimulant prescriptions, requiring regular check-ins and urine drug screens. The policies aimed to reduce inappropriate prescribing and diversion, but faced backlash from students and disability advocates who claimed the restrictions discriminated against people with legitimate ADHD. The debate revealed fundamental tensions between access and accountability that had no easy resolution. Research studies published in the early 2020s provided increasingly solid evidence that stimulant use among people without ADHD provided minimal academic benefits. A comprehensive meta-analysis in 2021 found no significant grade improvement associated with non-medical stimulant use after controlling for study time and effort. Another study showed that students believed their performance improved on Adderall even when objective measures showed no difference or actual declines. The research suggested decades of stimulant use were built on placebo effects and misattributed causation, rather than genuine cognitive enhancement. Yet the findings barely impacted usage patterns because the subjective experience felt real, regardless of what studies showed. Long-term cardiovascular outcomes data began emerging from cohort studies following stimulant users over decades. The results were concerning but not catastrophic. Heavy users showed modestly increased rates of hypertension, arrhythmias, and cardiovascular events compared to non-users. The absolute risk remained relatively small, but the population-level impact was significant given millions of users. The data suggested that widespread stimulant use was creating a subtle but real increase in cardiovascular disease burden that would manifest fully only decades hence. Current users in their 20s might face consequences in their 40s and 50s. Non-stimulant ADHD medications gained market share as concern about stimulant abuse and dependence increased. Atomoxetine, guanfacine, and other alternatives offered moderate effectiveness without abuse potential or cardiovascular risks. These medications never worked as dramatically as stimulants, producing subtler benefits that took weeks to emerge. For patients with genuine ADHD, non-stimulants often provided adequate symptom control. For students seeking performance enhancement, they were useless. The divergence in effectiveness between patient populations inadvertently served as a diagnostic test. Those who insisted on stimulants and rejected non-stimulant alternatives likely were seeking enhancement rather than treating genuine attention disorders. Cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD experienced renewed interest as both a standalone treatment and adjunct to medication. Therapists taught organizational skills, time management, and coping strategies that addressed ADHD symptoms without pharmaceutical intervention. The therapy required significant time and effort compared to taking a daily pill. Studies showed that CBT produced results comparable to medication for some patients, though effectiveness varied considerably across individuals. Insurance coverage for intensive therapy was often inadequate, creating cost barriers that medications didn't face. The reality was that pills remained more convenient and often cheaper than therapy, even if therapy worked comparatively well. Campus accommodation programs expanded to support students with ADHD through extended test time, reduced course loads, and organizational support without requiring medication. These programs recognized that ADHD created legitimate academic challenges that deserved accommodation regardless of treatment choices. Some students thrived using accommodations without pharmaceutical assistance. Others needed both medication and accommodations. The expansion of non-pharmaceutical supports provided alternatives that might have reduced stimulant use if implemented decades earlier, but they arrived too late to prevent the epidemic and probably insufficient to reverse it. Pharmaceutical companies responded to increasing scrutiny by developing new abuse-deterrent formulations and longer-acting versions of existing medications. These innovations served dual purposes, addressing legitimate concerns about diversion and abuse while securing new patents extending profitable market exclusivity. The abuse-deterrent technologies rarely prevented determined users from bypassing them, but they provided marketing advantages and regulatory approval benefits. The companies were adapting to new reality where stimulant products required at least superficial safety improvements to maintain social license to operate. The regulatory environment tightened significantly between 2022 and 2024 as state and federal agencies responded to mounting evidence of systemic overprescribing. New rules required documented neuropsychological testing for initial adult ADHD diagnosis in several states. Prescription monitoring programs flagged patients receiving stimulants from multiple prescribers. Insurance companies implemented prior authorization requirements for stimulant prescriptions that forced doctors to justify medical necessity before approval. These measures created friction in the prescription pipeline without fundamentally changing underlying dynamics. Determined patients could still obtain prescriptions through persistence and finding accommodating physicians. The international perspective revealed that American stimulant usage far exceeded other developed nations, suggesting cultural factors rather than epidemiology drove prescription rates. France diagnosed ADHD at 1/10 the American rate. Japan and South Korea maintained extremely low stimulant prescription rates, despite comparable academic pressures. European countries generally fell between these extremes. The variation proved that ADHD diagnosis and stimulant treatment reflected cultural attitudes and medical practice patterns as much as underlying neurological conditions. America's embrace of pharmaceutical performance enhancement was exceptional rather than universal, raising questions about whether high usage rates reflected genuine medical need or cultural pathology. Recovery communities for stimulant addiction began forming both online and in person as the population of former users reached critical mass. Reddit forums, Discord servers, and Facebook groups provided support for people attempting to quit or reduce stimulant use. These communities shared strategies for managing withdrawal, rebuilding natural motivation, and succeeding academically or professionally without pharmaceutical enhancement. The existence of substantial recovery communities indicated that significant numbers were recognizing stimulant use as problematic and seeking alternatives. However, these communities remained small compared to the total user population, suggesting most users hadn't reached that recognition yet. The narrative that had sustained 2 decades of expanding stimulant use was finally showing cracks by the mid-2010s. The belief that ADHD was massively underdiagnosed faced contradictory evidence of diagnosis, rates exceeding any plausible prevalence estimate. The claim that stimulants were safe with proper medical supervision looked questionable, given emergency room data and addiction rates. The promise that pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement was harmless and effective confronted research showing minimal academic benefits and significant health costs. Yet these narrative cracks hadn't produced fundamental change in prescribing patterns or usage rates. The machine built over decades to distribute stimulants broadly was self-sustaining despite mounting evidence that its foundation was questionable. Something more dramatic than evidence and argument would be required to actually reverse the trajectory. Whether that dramatic shift would come from regulatory crackdown, cultural awakening, or accumulating harms reaching undeniable levels remained uncertain in 2026. The numbers in 2026 told a story that would have seemed impossible when Richwood Pharmaceuticals rebranded Obitrol 30 years earlier. Over 41 million Adderall prescriptions were written annually in the United States, a figure that didn't include Vyvanse, Ritalin, or other ADHD stimulants that push the total past 60 million. Roughly 1 in 8 Americans aged 18-35 had active stimulant prescriptions. The medications designed to treat a neurological disorder affecting perhaps 5% of the population were now consumed by percentages far exceeding any credible prevalence estimate. The gap between medical justification and actual usage had become too wide to explain through better diagnosis or increased awareness alone. College campuses had reached a new equilibrium where 25-30% of students at competitive universities reported using prescription stimulants, with roughly half having legitimate prescriptions and half obtaining pills through informal markets. The distinction between prescribed and unprescribed users had blurred to meaninglessness, since both groups often use medication identically for academic performance rather than ADHD treatment. Freshman orientation now included implicit education about stimulant availability, alongside official warnings about substance abuse. Students arrived expecting to encounter Adderall, and most found it within their first semester through roommates, classmates, or campus health services. The normalization was so complete that parents openly discussed their children's Adderall use the way previous generations discussed ESAT prep courses. Conversations at school events casually mentioned prescriptions and dosing adjustments without shame or concern. The stigma that once attached to psychiatric medication and drug use had evaporated entirely for stimulants. Taking Adderall for academic performance had become as unremarkable as drinking coffee, wearing glasses, or using any other tool to optimize cognitive function. The cultural transformation was total. Professional workplaces had absorbed the stimulant culture that originated on campuses as those students graduated and entered careers. Silicon Valley tech companies maintained unspoken policies of tolerance towards stimulant use that drove the infamous work culture of all-nighters and impossible deadlines. Management consulting firms operated with the understanding that analysts used pharmaceutical enhancement to survive the demands. Law firms tacitly accepted that associates took Adderall to bill the expected hours. Wall Street trading desks looked the other way as long as performance remained strong. The corporate world had become dependent on a workforce chemically enhanced beyond natural human capacity. The philosophical questions that seemed urgent in the early 2000s had been answered through practice rather than deliberation. Was pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement different from coffee or tutoring? Society decided it wasn't through mass adoption. Where was the line between treatment and enhancement? The line had dissolved completely as legitimate ADHD treatment and performance enhancement became indistinguishable. Should society accept pharmaceutical performance pressure? It already had by allowing system-wide dependence on stimulants to develop without serious intervention. the debates were retrospectively pointless because actual behaviour had determined outcomes regardless of what ethicists concluded. The inequality dimensions had become starkly visible by 2026 in ways that early users never anticipated. Wealthy students accessed prescriptions easily through private psychiatrists who asked few questions and provided detailed documentation for academic accommodations. They could afford the best formulations and never worried about shortages because private pharmacies maintained adequate supply. Poor students faced overwhelmed campus health centres, insurance barriers, and pharmacy shortages that made consistent medication access difficult. The achievement gap that stimulants supposedly helped close was actually widening as pharmaceutical enhancement became another resource that wealth could secure reliably, while poverty created obstacles. International spread had accelerated through the 2020s as American academic culture exported globally. British universities reported stimulant usage rates climbing from essentially zero in 2010 to 15-20% by 2025 at top institutions. Australian campuses showed similar trends. European universities maintained lower rates due to stricter pharmaceutical regulations, but underground markets thrived wherever academic competition intensified. Asian universities in South Korea, Japan, and China saw emerging stimulant use despite cultural resistance to psychiatric medication. American students studying abroad introduced local students to pharmaceutical enhancement, creating distribution networks that persisted after exchange programs ended. The pattern had become depressingly familiar across different substances and contexts throughout pharmaceutical history. A medication developed for legitimate medical purposes got repurposed for enhancement or recreation. Initial use was limited to people with genuine medical needs or specific subcultures. Marketing and cultural shifts expanded usage to much broader populations. Medical gatekeeping eroded through combination of patient demand, physician complicity, and economic incentives. Eventually, society reached a new equilibrium where the substance was normalized and integrated into regular life. Regulation arrived years too late and proved ineffective against established cultural patterns. Amphetamines had followed this exact trajectory twice now, first with diet pills from the 1940s, 1970s, then with ADHD medications from the 1990s, 2020s. The outcomes were remarkably similar despite supposedly improved regulatory frameworks and medical understanding. The second wave actually reached further than the first, because ADHD provided more legitimate medical cover than obesity ever did. The diagnosis was more credible, the patient population more sympathetic, and the cultural context more accepting. These advantages allowed stimulants to achieve ubiquity that the diet pill era never reached despite consuming more pills per capita during that period. The next generation of cognitive enhancers was already emerging from research laboratories and underground synthesis operations. Modafinil had gained popularity as a supposedly safer alternative to traditional stimulants. Nootropic supplements of questionable efficacy flooded the market with claims of enhanced focus and memory. Prescription medications for Alzheimer's and narcolepsy were being tested off-label for cognitive enhancement. The cycle was preparing to repeat with different molecules but identical dynamics of medical justification, cultural acceptance, and regulatory failure. Pharmaceutical companies had learned the Adderall lesson well and were applying it to new products. The formula was straightforward: identify a legitimate medical condition affecting a small population, develop a medication that also appeals to much larger enhancement-seeking demographic, market aggressively while maintaining medical legitimacy, and profit from the gap between diagnosed patients and actual users. Future cognitive enhancers would follow this template because it worked spectacularly for generating revenue while avoiding regulatory crackdown. The current reality in 2026 was that stimulant use had become permanent infrastructure supporting modern achievement culture rather than a temporary aberration that might be corrected. Universities couldn't function without accommodating widespread stimulant use because too many students depended on it for academic survival. Employers couldn't suddenly demand that workers stop using performance enhancers because productivity expectations had adapted to chemically enhanced capability. The medical system couldn't restrict prescriptions significantly without creating humanitarian crises for millions dependent on daily stimulants. Society was locked into a situation where stopping seemed more disruptive than continuing, despite mounting evidence of problems. The costs of this equilibrium were distributed widely enough that no constituency had sufficient motivation to force change. Individual users experienced various harms but rationalized them as acceptable prices for academic or professional success. Families dealing with addiction or health complications blamed their specific doctors or pharmaceutical companies rather than the systemic dynamics that made problems inevitable. Universities acknowledged issues with stimulant culture, but treated them as student health concerns rather than institutional problems requiring structural changes. Politicians occasionally expressed concern but faced lobbying from pharmaceutical companies and patient advocacy groups that prevented meaningful legislation. The prescriptions kept flowing because everyone involved had adapted to a world where stimulants were normal and necessary. Doctors who'd been prescribing for decades couldn't suddenly decide that millions of their patients didn't actually need medication. Pharmaceutical companies had built business models around sustained stimulant sales that employed thousands and generated billions in economic activity. Patients who'd organized their lives around chemical enhancement couldn't easily transition to unmedicated existence. The momentum behind the status quo was overwhelming despite clear evidence that current practices were causing significant harm. Research continued accumulating, showing that stimulant use among people without ADHD produced minimal cognitive benefits, created various health risks, and generated substantial dependence. The studies barely mattered because behavior was driven by subjective experience and cultural expectations rather than objective evidence. Users believed stimulants helped them regardless of what research showed. Employers expected performance levels that seemed to require chemical enhancement. Educational institutions graded on curves that incorporated stimulant-enabled productivity. The system had adapted to pharmaceutical enhancement so thoroughly that evidence against effectiveness was irrelevant to decisions about usage. The question that remained unanswered in 2026 was whether the current situation represented stable equilibrium that would persist indefinitely or a temporary plateau before either further expansion or eventual contraction. Optimists argued that better regulation, improved education, and cultural shifts toward wellness might gradually reduce stimulant dependence over coming decades. Pessimists noted that every previous attempt to restrict pharmaceutical enhancement had failed against the combined forces of patient demand, medical complicity, and corporate profit. The most likely scenario was continuation of current patterns with minor fluctuations, but no fundamental change absent some dramatic catalyst. The broader implications extended beyond stimulants to questions about human enhancement, medical ethics, and social organization. Society had decided through practice that pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement was acceptable when packaged as disease treatment, that performance pressure could legitimately drive medical decisions, and that corporate profits took precedence over public health when the two conflicted. These decisions were never made explicitly through democratic processes, but emerged from millions of individual choices within institutional contexts designed to maximize prescription volume. The result was a pharmaceutical culture that served some interests excellently, while abandoning medical ethics and public health principles that supposedly governed the system. The Adderall story wasn't an accident or anomaly, but the logical outcome of combining achievement culture, pharmaceutical capitalism, and weak regulatory oversight. Every element was predictable individually, and their combination produced entirely foreseeable results. The system worked exactly as designed by its various architects, even though none of them would accept responsibility for the aggregate outcome. Pharmaceutical executives blamed overprescribing doctors. Physicians blamed patient demand and regulatory constraints. Regulators blamed insufficient enforcement resources. Patients blamed academic pressures and workplace demands. Everyone had reasonable explanations for their individual behavior, even as collective action produced mass stimulant dependence. The final irony was that the same cultural dynamics that created the Adderall epidemic were already operating on next-generation cognitive enhancers. The people who recognized problems with current stimulant use were simultaneously exploring novel nootropics, prescription medications, and brain stimulation technologies for cognitive enhancement. The desire for superhuman performance was so deeply embedded in modern achievement culture that pharmaceutical dependence seemed like acceptable cost rather than catastrophic failure. Future generations would likely look back on the Adderall era the way current observers viewed the amphetamine diet pill craze, obvious madness that somehow seemed reasonable to participants living through it. The story that began with a Romanian chemist synthesizing a molecule in 1887 and continued through World War II military use, 1950s diet pills, and ADHD medication had reached its current chapter but was far from finished. Millions of people would wake up tomorrow and take their Adderall or Vivance as routine as brushing teeth. Thousands more would seek their first prescriptions through campus health centers or telehealth services. Pharmaceutical companies would earn billions from continued sales. Doctors would write prescriptions because refusing seemed more problematic than accommodating, and the entire system would continue functioning smoothly despite fundamental problems that everyone could see, but nobody could effectively address. The machine was too powerful, too profitable, and too culturally entrenched to stop even if anyone actually wanted to stop it. The next chapter was already being written through the daily actions of people who believed they were making rational individual choices while collectively perpetuating patterns that had captured an entire generation in pharmaceutical dependence disguised as medical treatment.